Chapter 1193 A Myriad of Secret Techniques. Chapter 1193 A Myriad of Secret Techniques. Numerous light orbs hovered around the palace. If one looked closely, they would see that there were countless characters churning within these light orbs. However, these characters were blurry, and it was hard to see them clearly. Those are all cultivation techniques. I think I saw the Great Net Mind Refreshing Technique, Purple Smoke Palm Technique, Bamboo Heart Sword. The 7 King Tears read name after name as they stared at the light orbs in the sky. The characters in some light orbs were easier to decipher than others. What? He Tao cried out in surprise. Virtuous Origin Heart Sutra. I saw an incomplete copy of this technique in an ancient sect once. This is a profound cultivation technique, and even that ancient sect only owned a damaged copy. I heard that if one masters this cultivation technique, their origin power will gain the power of lightning. As such, they'll be able to obliterate their enemies' defenses with ease. This was an ancient cultivation technique, and it had been passed down for heaven knew how many tens of thousands of years. However, it had become a lost technique already, and only the inheritances of some ancient sects still contained scraps of records about it. Was this Virtuous Origin Heart Sutra the complete version, or was it an incomplete version? If it were the complete version, its value would be incalculable. At this moment, they understood that this was indeed a treasure storage. Moreover, the value of its contents was far beyond their imagination. Shinjuer was the first to leap up and grab at one of the light orbs. Her speed was incredible, and her hand was just about to clutch around the light orb. However, that light orb suddenly tremored, and it shot away at an even quicker speed. Shinjuer had only been a whisker away from grabbing hold of it. Shinjuer landed back on the floor empty-handed. The remaining 6 King Tears were all astonished. Shinjuer wasn't weaker than any of them. Thus, if she couldn't grab hold of a light orb, then it was very likely that none of them would be able to, either. Trying to obtain these inheritances would be immensely difficult. The 7 of them stopped speaking. They all locked onto a secret technique that they desired, and then leaped over to grab at it. It was as if the myriad of light orbs had come to life at this moment, and they all weaved around like agile fish. Light flashed through the air, and it was dazzling to the extreme. After leaping around for a while, the 7 King Tears gradually calmed down and stopped. When the last person stopped, the light orbs in the air also came to a rest. They were like stars hanging in the sky. They're truly difficult to obtain. The brows of the 7 King Tears knitted into frowns. Although they were the King Tears of the younger generation, they were genuinely in a difficult situation at this moment. Xiao! Right at this moment, however, 7 light orbs suddenly tremored and shot toward the 7 people. Ling Han and the others hurriedly caught the light orbs. Pa! They each caught a light orb with extreme ease. What was going on? They hadn't been able to obtain anything before, no matter how hard they tried. Yet these light orbs were actively shooting toward them now. Pa! The light orbs shattered one after another. Countless characters and images appeared in their minds, and along with them, different cultivation techniques and martial arts techniques. Ling Han didn't know what techniques the others had received. However, he received a movement technique called the star plucking step. Upon reaching the peak stage of this technique, he would be able to ascend the heavens with a single step, plucking the stars and grasping the moons. Of course, this description was slightly exaggerated. Even so, it still revealed the impressive nature of this movement technique. As to what level one could reach with this technique, that depended on each person's fortune and comprehension. Ling Han skimmed over the movement technique in his mind. However, it was extremely complex, and it wasn't something that he could digest in a short amount of time. He would need at least a few years to comprehend this technique. In fact, he might need a decade or even several decades. Immortal level techniques were all like this. Formations, pill recipes, and movement techniques were all the same. One would need to spend an exorbitant amount of time to comprehend, grasp, and utilize them. However, Ling Han wasn't annoyed. Instead, he was delighted. He had the reincarnation tree, so time really wasn't an issue. Moreover, the longer one needed to spend on a technique, the more valuable that technique would be. Shinjuer and the others also wore looks of delight. It was evident that they had each received an extraordinary secret technique. They all looked up at the light orbs in the air, their expressions showing that they were hell-bent on obtaining more. The random light orbs that had shot over had contained supreme secret techniques, so the value of the light orbs in the air was definitely unfathomable. However, no more light orbs shot over. It was as if those light orbs were the reward for them opening the door to this palace. The 7 king tears lunged toward the light orbs again. Unsurprisingly, they all came up empty-handed. No other light orbs shot over, and this left all of them extremely disappointed. Countless treasures hovered before them, yet they could only look but not obtain them. This was torture. Hee. Do you want more cultivation techniques? A voice suddenly asked. This voice was soft and serene, and it was as if it were right next to the ears, yet it also sounded distant at the same time. Who is it? The 7 king tears shouted in astonishment. Show yourself. Don't hide in the shadows. You people want to see me that badly. The voice drifted into their ears again, and tendrils of black aura formed in the surroundings. This black aura was the same as the black aura outside the mystery realm. Moreover, it even possessed an air of death. The black aura formed a person amidst the 7 king tears. Who are you? Shirangwa immediately asked. I'm naturally the owner of this place, the person said. Ling Han and the others glanced at each other before bowing and saying, Our respects, senior. They were all proud individuals, so they naturally wouldn't kneel. However, they had accepted secret techniques from this person, so it was only right that they bowed in respect. Raise your heads, the person said as he raised his hand. However, his body was relatively unstable, and it continued to drift and distort. All of you are supremely talented individuals who are worthy of receiving my inheritance. The 7 king tears bowed again and said, Thank you, senior. However, I only need one successor. Which of you is willing to acknowledge me as master? The person asked. Ling Han and the others glanced at each other again. Whom does senior want to take as a disciple? They asked. Although this person had claimed that they were the owner of this place, should they really believe his words? As people who had become king tiers, they were naturally capable of making their own judgments. How could they blindly trust others? If I were to choose, the aura-formed person purposefully paused and swept his gaze over all 7 of them. It was as if he were observing their reactions. However, how could Ling Han and the others be affected by this? Their expressions remained calm and composed. I would choose him. The person raised his hand and pointed at Ling Han. Me. Ling Han shook his head and said, Apologies, but I have no intentions of acknowledging a master. Even if he wanted to acknowledge a master, he had a saint in his black tower. There was no need for him to acknowledge this aura-formed person as master. The person couldn't help but feel astonished. Ling Han had actually refused his offer. To the large majority of people, acknowledging elites as masters should have been an irresistible temptation. However, Ling Han hadn't hesitated at all before shaking his head and turning down his offer. The aura-formed person turned his gaze elsewhere. He pointed at Shinjuer and said, What about you? Are you willing to acknowledge me as master? Shinjuer hesitated briefly before saying, This junior already has a master, so I also have no intention of acknowledging a new master. His offer was turned down again. The auriformed person grimaced slightly. It was as if he had taken a blow, and he asked, "What about you people?" He pointed at the 5 remaining king tiers. The 5 king tiers exchanged a glance, and then all shook their heads in reply. This person had suddenly appeared, and was now tempting them to become his disciple. The 7 king tiers couldn't help but feel suspicious. Chapter 1194, Possession. Chapter 1194, Possession. The auriformed person was a little irritated. He was more so unable to accept this. There were 7 people, yet not a single one of them was willing to acknowledge him as master. Did they all think that they were Genesis tier saints? "Since none of you are willing to acknowledge me as master, the secret techniques of this palace will have nothing else to do with you 7, he said emotionlessly. He paused for a moment, and then gazed at the 7 king tiers. A smug look appeared on his face when he saw the corners of their eyes twitch. He didn't believe that these youths could maintain their composure and resist the temptation of the secret techniques. However, these secret techniques are useless to me, so it's not as if I can't bestow them to you 7, the auriformed person continued. He paused and looked at them again. He always stopped at the critical points. Ling Han was the first to react, saying, "It looks like Senior has some conditions." The auriformed person smiled and said, "They're not conditions, per se. I passed away long ago, and what's left of me right now is only a wisp of my willpower. As such, I can't collect those secret techniques, even if I want to. So, I need one of you to act as a host for my willpower. That way, I'll be able to retrieve those secret techniques. If anyone wants those secret techniques, let me borrow their body for a moment. Otherwise, there's absolutely nothing I can do." Solemn expressions appeared on Ling Han and the others' faces when they heard this. Was he trying to possess them? He had made it sound enticing, saying that he was only borrowing someone's body to retrieve those light orbs. However, what if he didn't leave their body? Moreover, he claimed that he had already passed away and said that only a wisp of his willpower was remaining. However, who could guarantee that this was true? What if this was a damaged soul? If that were the case, letting him enter their body would be suicide. "Who wants these secret techniques?" the auriformed person asked. His voice was dripping with temptation. Ling Han and the others remained silent, and they all entered a defensive stance. Although this auriformed person wore a facade of politeness, who knew whether he would flip out in rage after being rejected? "No one," the auriformed person asked. He sighed upon seeing that no one was going to answer him. "I had initially wanted to use a simpler method. By the looks of it, I can only use the more difficult method now." He swept his gaze over them, then pointed at Ling Han and said, "Your body is the most suitable for me. I've never seen such a powerful physique before. In fact, no one in history has been able to reach such a level in the mountain river tier. However, your divine sense is also incredibly tough. I'm not confident that I can erase it. Thank you for your praise, Senior. However, it seems like you're a little short-sighted. The world is enormous, so who knows whether there are other supreme prodigies?" Ling Han said calmly. This auriformed person had tried to use words before resorting to force. He had used secret techniques to entice them, and was only turning to force after realizing that no one would bite his bait. That being the case, Ling Han didn't need to be polite either. Anyhow, the auriformed person had tried to persuade them with words first. So what did that signify? This hinted at the fact that he no longer possessed his eternal river tier strength. Otherwise, why would he need to tempt mountain river tier cultivators? The auriformed person didn't become angry. He simply shook his head and said, "I traveled the world for countless years, so what prodigies haven't I seen? Hee." He turned his attention to Shenjuer and said, "I can sense a powerful bloodline in this young lady's body. Shame, what a shame. Her divine sense is protected by a secret technique, and I'm not powerful enough to challenge it at this moment." He went through the 7 king tiers. listing out all of their strengths. Ling Han and the others were all astounded. His vision was incredible, and he had been spot on with everything that he had said. In the end, the aura-formed person pointed at Wu Zhi and said, "You're the weakest of the 7. Relatively speaking, you're also the least talented. You're not the best host for my soul, but you're definitely the easiest to possess. So I won't be too fussy." As he spoke, he formed into a streak of light that shot toward Wu Zhi's body. Wu Zhi was naturally prepared, and he hurriedly crossed his arms, raising his power to the extreme. Close to 90 divine patterns appeared around his body. Since he didn't know what this aura-formed person was, he took a more conservative approach, just in case. Right now, the most important thing was to protect himself. Divine patterns flashed through the air. These were the regulations of heaven and earth, and they represented the might of the pinnacle level. However, they were utterly useless against the uncanny aura-formed person. The streak of light pierced through Wu Zhi's defenses and shot into his mouth. "Ah!" Wu Zhi instantly wailed in agony. His arms and legs spread wide open, and his head was forcefully thrown back. The black aura surged into his mouth, forming a misty cloud around his head. It appeared extremely uncanny. Humph! Ling Han and the others naturally wouldn't stand aside and watch. They all retrieved their god tools and slashed at the black aura. "Kakaka, you want to wound me with such measly power? You're several epochs too young." The unbridled laugh of the black aura cut straight into their minds. This was voice transmission through the divine sense. Regardless of how the 6 king tiers attacked the black aura, it simply shifted in shape and size. They were completely unable to wound this mysterious being. Meanwhile, the black aura continued to surge into Wu Zhi's body, causing his stomach to expand at a rate that was visible to the naked eye. Before long, Wu Zhi's stomach had already expanded to the size of a wok. It was as if he had become morbidly obese. There was an agonized look on his face, and the veins on his face were all popping out. His eyes also looked like they were about to pop out of his head. The shape of his face also continued to shift. He was himself at times, though his face would become that of another person at other times. It was extremely eerie. "Xiao!" The last wisp of black aura crept into Wu Zhi's mouth at this moment, and his stomach suddenly shrunk back to its original size. It was as if they had been seeing things just then. There was a dazed look on Wu Zhi's face as he stared at Ling Han and the others, and he was just about to raise his arm and say something. However, he suddenly grabbed his head and began to wail in agony. A devastating aura exploded from his body. It was eerie, sinister, and filled with an air of death. It felt just like the yellow spring in the sky outside. Damn it, he's about to be possessed. Once that person succeeds, his strength might increase by an explosive amount. Ling Han and the others all cried out in alarm. Possessions were actually very rare, ordinarily speaking. What elite would abandon their own body to take over another person's body? Possession meant that one would have to forsake their own cultivation. Moreover, when the regulations of heaven and earth determined one's lifespan, they would do so based on the divine sense of the person. Thus, an old and near-death cultivator wouldn't gain the lifespan of a younger cultivator even if they possessed their body. However, if this mysterious being successfully possessed Wu Zhi's body, there was a great possibility that he would gain the strength of an Eternal River tier elite. As such, his battle prowess would see a terrifying increase. "Kill him," Wu Wentong said resolutely. With Wu Zhi's strength, there was no way that he could resist the possession of the mysterious being. That being the case, it would also be impossible for them to drag the divine sense out of his body. Thus, their only option was to kill Wu Zhi before the possession of his body was complete. "Kill him," Shinjuer said with a nod. Disciples of the Majestic Heaven sect weren't allowed to kill each other. However, that depended on the situation. Right now, Wu Zhi already wasn't Wu Zhi. Instead, he was in the process of becoming a terrifying demon. They had to kill him in the cradle. The 6 king tiers charged toward Wu Jia in unison. Chapter 1195. 6 king tiers join hands. Chapter 1195. 6 king tiers join hands. Although Wu Jia was also a king tier of the younger generation, there was no doubt that he was the weakest of the 7 king tiers. This was one of the reasons for the mysterious being choosing him. The weaker his target, the easier they would be to possess. Moreover, the success rate would also be higher. Possessing others was in defiance of heaven and earth. Thus, he still had to be especially careful, even though he was an extremely powerful being. As a result, he could only choose a weakling like Wu Jia. This would maximize his chance of success. Now that Wu Jia was being attacked by 6 king tiers, it was very likely that he would be insta-killed. 1. Their attacks arrived before Wu Jia, yet he simply raised his hand and lightly pushed outward. An invisible barrier appeared, blocking all of their attacks. He smiled and said, "Please have some patience. I'll get around to killing you all when I familiarize myself with this body." His smile was wicked and sinister. Ling Han and the others were stunned. How was this possible? Weren't there restrictions that targeted power at and above the Sun-Moon tier here? This mysterious being had blocked their attacks so easily, so his power was definitely above the Mountain River tier. Why wasn't he attacked by the restriction? Hee, this isn't power, but regulations, Wu Jia said with a chuckle. However, black aura shrouded his face at this moment, and he naturally wasn't the same person as before. Rather, he was the mysterious being who had possessed Wu Jia. He kindly explained himself, saying, "Back when I was alive, I was almost at the pinnacle of the Eternal River tier. I was only a step away from reaching the Genesis tier. So, how can you measly ants fathom my grasp of regulations?" He casually twisted his body. Pa. His bones crackled, and his body instantly underwent a dramatic transformation. It was as if he were reshaping the appearance of this body to suit himself. Shatter! Ling Han and the other king tiers all unleashed their supreme might. Although this mysterious being had been frighteningly powerful in the past, only a wisp of his soul was still remaining at this moment. Moreover, he was relying on the body of a Mountain River tier cultivator to unleash his might. It would be extremely abnormal if he could still wield the battle prowess of an Eternal River tier elite. Ling Han and the 5 others were king tiers of the younger generation. Even if there were other king tiers in the vast immortal realm, it was very likely that they would only be as powerful as them. They were all at the peak stage of the pinnacle level, so it would be extraordinarily difficult to surpass them, even by just a tiny margin. It was just that Shen Zhuer and the others didn't dare to unleash their full 10-star power at this moment. Otherwise, they would be attacked by the restriction of this mystery realm. In that case, they wouldn't be raising their battle prowess, they would be seeking death. The 6 king tiers unleashed their most powerful attacks at Wu Jia. Wu Jia appeared especially at ease, and he simply battled against them using a single hand. In fact, the regulations that he used were also extremely basic. They were simply composed of a few divine patterns. However, the might that they released was tremendous, and they were easily able to block the 6 king tiers' attacks. Meanwhile, he continued to restructure his body. Numerous bone spikes protruded from his back, and there was even a solitary horn growing from his forehead. The horn glowed with a faint silver luster. If Wu Jia still had his own consciousness, perhaps he might even be pleased with these changes. Although he had been a member of the 7 king tiers before, he had undoubtedly been the weakest link in the chain. Now, however, he could withstand the combined attacks of the other 6 king tiers all by himself. Moreover, he could do so with absolute ease. This was an incredible feat if word of this got out. He would definitely become the #1 prodigy in the world. He wouldn't be one of the most powerful prodigies, but the most powerful prodigy. Unfortunately, he was no longer Wu Jia. Wu Jia twisted his neck and said, "Amazing! This feels amazing. He was at least twice as tall as before, and his physique was also much thicker and bulkier. His skin also appeared very black and patchy. Looking carefully, one would realize that these were actually patches of divine patterns. It was as if he had been born with these divine patterns on his skinset. Was impossible to see any signs of artificial altering. He stretched his body lazily, then smiled and stared at the 6 king tears. Little sh*ts, how should I kill you? Should I steam you to death, or should I braise you to death? Fuck your mom. Ling Han retreated by some distance and fired his annihilating dragon star arrow at Wu Zhe. Pa! Wu Zhe raised his right hand and caught the origin power arrow between 2 fingers. This was absolutely terrifying. How fast was the annihilating dragon star arrow? Yet he had actually caught it between 2 fingers. He grinned and said, "This arrow is fairly interesting. Had my grasp of the regulations of heaven and earth not been far above you, I really might have been hit. It's effective." Shen Zhuge shouted in excitement. "His hand has been wounded." Sure enough, blood was flowing from the webs of Wu Zhe's fingers. Damn it! Wu Zhe's expression darkened, and he said, "This body is still too weak. Although his grasp of regulations is far above us, his body isn't stronger because of this," Shi Onggua immediately said. "His power is also unchanged. We still have a chance to defeat him." He Tao said. The 6 of them nodded in agreement. They were all king tears, so which of them didn't possess Will of Steel? Although they were in a dire situation, none of them was panicked or flustered. Rather, they analyzed the situation with calm and composure. Wu Zhe sneered and said, "So what? Under the suppression of my regulations, what trouble can you people pose?" He extended his hand toward them. Boom! The divine patterns on his body lit up and transformed into lengths of divine chains that whipped toward the 6 king tears. Ling Han and the others hurriedly jumped aside. Wu Zhe's power wasn't much weaker than theirs, and coupled with his far more powerful regulations, his battle prowess was already at a level that they couldn't match. Ha ha ha! Wu Zhe laughed loudly. It appeared as if a sliver of his original awareness still remained. Otherwise, what was there for him to be so smug about? Ling Han and the others were merely mountain river tier ants that he could suppress with a flip of his hands. Ling Han continued to fire his annihilating dragon star arrow, and he tried his best to maintain the distance between him and Wu Zhe. The annihilating dragon star arrow was something that could threaten Wu Zhe. Wu Zhe didn't dare to be careless around these attacks. His battle prowess was indeed powerful, but his cultivation was still only at the mountain river tier. This was a significant weak point. It meant that he had to deal with attacks from Ling Han and the others. Otherwise, his body would be gravely wounded if he were hit by one of the arrows. This gave the young king tears time to move around and unleash their most powerful attacks. Green bamboo ambush! Shen Zhuge shouted. Her glabella split open, and a small bamboo surprisingly shot out from it. It expanded rapidly, eventually becoming an astonishingly large bamboo. However, its shape wasn't rigid, and this allowed it to remain unaffected in this relatively limited space. Shwa! The bamboo shook slightly, causing countless leaves to fall down. These leaves then transformed into bamboo, swords that swept toward Wu Zhe. Purple flames! Shi Onggua roared. Flames burst from his body, and a fiery lion that was engulfed in purple divine flames appeared as he clapped his hands together. The lion lunged toward Wu Zhe. Surging black water. He Tao held. One of his eyes shut tightly, while his other eye remained wide open. A black river surged from his body. The 6 king tears all unleashed their trump cards. No one dared to hold back at this moment. Otherwise, it was truly possible that they would lose their lives here. Boom! Divine light illuminated the surroundings and swept toward Wu Zhe. Chapter 1196. Defeat. Chapter 1196, Defeat. Theoretically speaking, Wu Zhi definitely wouldn't be able to withstand the combined attacks of the 6 king tiers, unless he possessed a physique as freakish as Ling Han's. However, Wu Zhi retracted his divine chains just before the 6 attacks hit him. The divine chains wrapped around each other and transformed into an orb that possessed an incredible defensive ability. Pung, pung, pung. The attacks landed, yet they were unable to penetrate the ball of divine chains. Their attacks couldn't even penetrate the ball of divine chains. So how could they wound Wu Zhi? Hee, abandon your meaningless resistance. You people are nothing but ants before my absolute power. Wu Zhi laughed and continued, You should feel honored to die by my hands. Remember that I used to be an Eternal River tier elite. At that time, I was too lazy to even kill heavenly body tier insects. However, you people are going to experience the honor of being killed by me. How glorious is this? Ha ha ha. Ling Han laughed loudly and said, I'll even possess the ability to kill saints in the future. So, why don't you obediently stick your head over and let me hack it off? I'll allow you to experience an even greater glory. Humph. Wu Zhi's expression became cold, and he shouted, You! It appears as if the previous owner of this body detests you immensely. A killing intent has naturally arisen. Oh, I simply gave him a beating, Ling Han said calmly. If you want to, I can also give you a beating. What an arrogant brat. Wu Zhi's expression darkened. Although he had been a supreme elite in the past and it was thus beneath him to argue with a mountain river tier cultivator who was still displeased when being talked back to like that. He truly wanted to slap Ling Han to death. However, Xinjuer and the others had already launched their second volley of attacks. This forced him to go back on the defensive. After all, he was no longer an Eternal River tier elite. Ling Han seized this opportunity to unleash his ultimate arrow. He hadn't participated in the second volley of attacks. Instead, he had waited until Wu Zhi blocked this volley of attacks and unraveled the divine chains that shielded him. He was going to take advantage of this instant to kill him. There was only a single chance. Although his power could recover quickly, that mysterious being wouldn't fall for the same trick twice. He was too powerful and too smart for that. All of you die. After blocking the second volley of attacks, the mysterious being unraveled the orb of divine chains, just as Ling Han had expected. Countless divine chains shot toward Ling Han and the others, seeking to penetrate their bodies. One's defenses would be at their weakest right after they launched their most powerful attack. This was the same for everyone. Pu, Piu, Piu, Piu. Xinjuer and the 4 other king tiers were all struck by the divine chains. Some were hit in the hands, while others were hit in the legs. Some were hit in the torso. Regardless of where the divine chains hit, they were able to pierce straight through the king tiers. Blood sprayed through the air. It was at this moment that Ling Han unleashed his ultimate arrow. Pooh! However, he was also struck by the divine chains the instant that he unleashed the arrow. He hadn't dodged or evaded, so it was only natural that he was struck. Fortunately, his physique was powerful enough. The divine chains had only been able to pierce into his body and were unable to crush his godly bones. They hadn't been able to penetrate all the way through his body, either. Xiao, the brilliant arrow one that carried the hopes of Ling Han, shot toward Wu Zhi. It was as quick as light, and it was truly an arrow of ultimate speed. Aya! Wu Zhi roared in pain. The ultimate arrow had hit his left shoulder, and the explosiveness of the arrow had obliterated it completely. His left arm fell to the floor, and a fountain of blood gushed from his shoulder. This was already the result of him instinctively blocking with his divine chains and slightly altering the path of the arrow. If he hadn't done so, it would have been his heart that exploded, not his left shoulder. Brat, I'm going to kill you. Wu Zhi roared in fury. He was both shocked and enraged. He had almost died at the hands of a measly mountain river tier cultivator. He was so infuriated that he could barely think straight. Xiao! The divine chains whipped back toward Wu Zhe, at the same time bringing Ling Han closer to him. Wu Zhe raised a hand and unleashed another 7 divine chains. These divine chains shot toward Ling Han's hands, feet, chest, and abdomen. How could Ling Han block these divine chains? The ultimate arrow was indeed mighty, yet it would exhaust his power after a single use. Even though his speed of recovery was quicker now, he would still need an entire 30 minutes to fully recover his power. However, he only had a few seconds right now, and this was barely enough time to recover even a shred of his stamina. Ling Han was unable to defend against this attack, and he was ruthlessly struck by the 7 divine chains. Pooh! Blood sprayed from his body. However, Wu Zhe was still rendered speechless. Ling Han had been utterly defenseless, yet his divine chains still hadn't been able to pierce through his body completely. As such, they hadn't caused any significant damage. Fuck! How can there be such a freak? Wu Zhe was slightly astonished. If he were at his strongest, he would be able to crush Ling Han with a simple wave of his hand. However, he could only rely on the power of regulations at this moment. The problem was his cultivation level was too low. As such, the amount and quality of regulations that he could wield were also limited. If he tried to summon regulations above his cultivation level, his body would be obliterated by the regulations first. Thus, his divine chains could only cause minor damage to Ling Han, even though they could cause severe damage to Shinjuer and the others. Humph! I'll slowly tear you to pieces then, Wu Zhe said coldly. He shook his divine chains and sent Shinjuer and the 4 other king tears flying. Pung, pung, pung. They all crashed into the walls of the palace. Meanwhile, Wu Zhe brandished all of his divine chains, planning to launch a thick and furious attack on Ling Han. If he couldn't kill him with a single attack, he would grind him to death slowly and steadily, like ants slowly biting an elephant to death. Ling Han's physique was indeed as tough as level 5 godly metal. However, Wu Zhe's divine chains were like a saw that could slowly cut through level 5 godly metal. He simply needed a bit of time. Pooh, piu, piu. Ling Han was struck by the divine chains again. He had barely recovered any of his power at this moment, so he was naturally being belted like a sandbag. Shinjuer and the others were all gravely wounded, so they wouldn't be able to help him anytime soon. The divine chains continued to strike Ling Han, and he quickly transformed into a bloodied figure. Ha 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 ha. Wu Zhe laughed loudly. This unbridled laugh contained both the emotions of the mysterious being as well as the pleasure of Wu Zhe himself. Ling Han had humiliated him in public before, so how could he not hate him? Ling Han was being mercilessly beaten, yet he still continued to recover his power. He was waiting for a chance to counterattack. If there were truly no chance of winning, he wouldn't insist on continuing this battle either. He would hide into the Black Tower and perhaps even chuck Notionless Sane out. Doing so would probably give this mysterious being a huge fright. Shenjuer and the others naturally didn't know that Ling Han still had the Black Tower. Upon seeing him being mercilessly beaten, they were certain that there was already no chance for him to turn the tables. Meanwhile, they were all severely wounded and only barely hanging on to life. By the looks of it, defeat was inevitable. Apart from waiting for death, what else could they still do? Although they still had trump cards, this mystery realm forbade power at or above the Sun-Moon tier. Anyhow, faced with the formidable regulations wielded by this mysterious being, it seemed as if everything that they did was in vain. If they unleashed their trump cards, they would merely be seeking an earlier death. They would be killed by the restrictions, which was simply an alternate method of death with an alternate killer. Was there really no other way? They were all individuals with steely willpower, and they definitely wouldn't give up even in the face of despair. Their minds whirred as they analyzed all the possible methods. Hee hee, Sinking shade, old demon. You've finally come out after all. A thunder-like voice suddenly boomed through the surroundings, causing the entire palace to tremor. What? There's another person here. Ling Han and the others were all filled with renewed hope. In the current situation, a new variable was extremely desirable. Chapter 1197. 10-million-year-old plot. Chapter 1197. 10-million-year-old plot. What? Wu Zhe's expression changed drastically, and he exclaimed, Lan Yin, you're still not dead! He looked at the corpse on the floor. There was a chuckle, and the blue-skinned corpse on the floor surprisingly crawled up. A long shadow was cast by its 9-meter-tall figure. Ling Han and the others were all astounded. Although they had been suspicious whether the mysterious being was the true owner of this place, they were still stunned to see the blue-skinned elite get to his feet. Wu Zhe stared at the blue-skinned elite, and he started to laugh loudly after a short while, saying, So, you truly are dead. Your body is merely being controlled by a wisp of your remnant awareness. Indeed, the blue-skinned elite said with a nod. However, it's more than enough to kill you. Wu Zhe's expression changed, and he said with a hint of panic, You didn't purposefully set this up, did you? Were you waiting for an opportunity to kill me? For my divine sense to leave the land's heart and possess another body? The blue-skinned elite laughed loudly and said, Or else, you had fled to the land's heart, and I hadn't been able to pursue you in my dying state. If I didn't draw you out, how would I be able to deal with you? As such forbearance, Wu Zhe said, It's already been tens of millions of years, and your corpse has almost turned to dust. Why are you still holding on to such old grudges? Why do you insist on killing me? Humph! Even if I die 1,000 times over, I still won't forgive wretches from the netherworld. The blue-skinned elite roared. What? This mysterious being is actually from the netherworld. At this moment, it finally made sense why the words carved by the blue-skinned elite were filled with fury and killing intent toward the netherworld. From the signs of battle outside, it could be deduced that an intense battle had broken out between the two elites. The blue-skinned elite had probably won, but suffered fatal wounds. Meanwhile, the body of the mysterious being had been obliterated, such that only his divine sense remained. However, due to the unique nature of beings from the netherworld, he had been able to hold onto life in the land's heart. Tens of millions of years had passed, and the mysterious being thought that the blue-skinned elite had died. Thus, he came out to possess someone's body so that he could live a second life. Anyhow, the restriction in this mystery realm was most likely used to suppress the mysterious being and limit his activity to the palace. Otherwise, this mysterious being should have escaped long ago with the great number of times that this mystery realm had already been opened. The mysterious being had simply thought that the restriction was in place to suppress him for all eternity. However, he hadn't realized that this was a double-layered scheme. The restriction was merely in place to give him a feeling of security, to make him believe that he could possess someone and escape. Now, however, his physical body was unbelievably fragile. Wu Zhe trembled in apprehension. He hadn't been this nervous and terrified even when his original body had been obliterated. He had only just possessed this body, so it was impossible for his divine sense to leave. Lan Yin, how scheming of you, he spat through gritted teeth. Against a coward like you, how could I not scheme? The blue-skinned elite smiled and continued, Don't even think about wasting time. Although this is only a wisp of my awareness, I can still stay around for 3 to 5 days. Wu Zhe's expression changed again. He had indeed wanted to waste time. Unlike him, the blue-skinned elite had genuinely died. There was only a wisp of his awareness remaining, and it was like a flame without fuel. It would disappear in no time. However, 3 to 5 days was still too long. This blue-skinned elite absolutely despised beings from the netherworld. So how could he last for 3 to 5 days? Even if he spoke until his mouth was cracked and dry, it still wouldn't be long enough to grind through 5 days. The blue-skinned elite attacked and said, "Sinking shade, old demon, accept your death!" Boom! A terrifying power swept through the palace, and even the mystery realm shuddered. This was a power that transcended the heavenly body tier. Why didn't the restriction attack him? What a joke! Of course it didn't. He was the owner of this place, so why would the restriction attack him? Boom! His palm struck down, and Wuja instantly transformed into a cloud of blood. His body was far too fragile, and there was simply no way it could withstand power at the eternal river tier. However, the blue-skinned elite didn't let his guard down. Instead, he continued to scan the surroundings with his divine sense. Elites from the netherworld weren't easy to kill. He had obliterated this mysterious being's body in the past, yet his divine sense had still managed to escape. Humph! Still trying to escape? The blue-skinned elite struck at the door. Pum! The large door shattered, and they saw a shadow frantically streak out. This shadow was extremely hard to catch with the naked eye. It was the elite from the netherworld. Ling Han and the other king tiers all sucked in a sharp breath. An eternal river tier elite with a huge advantage in cultivation level had attacked him. Yet he had still been able to survive and flee. The being from the netherworld was unfathomably powerful. Lan Yin, you actually forced me to use this technique. Even if you die, I'll still grind your bones to dust. The shadow flew toward the yellow spring in the sky. This yellow spring was formed from the corpse of the netherworld elite, so his power would increase by an immense amount if he fused his divine sense into it. However, his previous body had already died, so the yellow spring would still be extremely dangerous to him. It was like a potent poison. Even so, he had no option but to take a massive gamble. Otherwise, he would definitely die. As long as he survived, there was hope that he could heal his wounds, no matter how severe they were. The blue-skinned elite humphed and said, "I've plotted for tens of millions of years now, so how can I fall at the final hurdle?" His body flashed, and he dashed out at an incredible speed. His fist smashed into the yellow spring in the sky. "Star plucking step," Ling Han exclaimed in his mind. Although he still hadn't started to cultivate this movement technique yet, he could still recognize it at a single glance. Hua! The yellow spring was severed in the middle. The blue-skinned elite shuddered, and then transformed into a giant that measured 3,000 meters in height. He blocked the flow of the yellow spring as he stood proudly in the sky. "You!" The netherworld elite wanted to vomit blood. He could no longer draw on the power of the yellow spring. His voice shrill, he shouted, "You're blocking the power of the dark yellow spring with your body, so you'll turn to bones in no time. If you want to die, phut!" He had subconsciously treated the blue-skinned elite as a living person. However, he quickly came to his senses. Although this blue-skinned elite was jumping around and attacking him, his vitality had already disappeared long ago. He was merely a remnant wisp of awareness that definitely couldn't last for long. That being the case, what did it matter whether his body disintegrated or not? After all, he had already been dead for tens of millions of years. Ha ha ha! I've been waiting for this day. The blue-skinned elite thrust his palm toward the shadow. Countless divine patterns intertwined, and the glow of regulations radiated brilliantly. This was the true power of eternal river tier elites. "No!" The netherworld elite wailed in despair. His wail instantly traveled throughout the entire mystery realm. This was the despairing cry of an eternal river tier elite. A thick sense of loathing and agitation hung in the air. There was also a harrowing eeriness. This was a martial intent that was unique to netherworld cultivators. "It's finally over." A relieved smile spread across the blue-skinned elite's face. Boom! His gigantic body crashed down, rapidly shrinking in size as it did so. It was then washed away by the yellow spring, becoming one of the tens of millions of wraiths. A supreme elite had finally disappeared from this world once and for all. Ling Han and the 5 other king tiers were all speechless. They had been close to useless in this battle. They had simply been used as bait. They were the prodigious king tiers of the younger generation, yet they had actually fallen to the level of mere bait. Chapter 1198. The Rain Emperor had disappeared. Chapter 1198. The Rain Emperor had disappeared. They were prodigious king tiers, yet they could only act as mere bait. This left Ling Han and the others feeling extremely uncomfortable. However, this was the undeniable truth. As prodigious as they were still mere trash before power at the Eternal River tier. The death of Wu Zhe was a bloody reminder of this fact. He had become a host to the divine sense of a netherworld elite, and in the end he had been mercilessly killed. Before the blue-skinned elite, even the most talented prodigies of this galaxy were like fragile debris. They didn't even have the right to make him hesitate. This was a fate that could befall any one of them. However, why had such a fate befallen Wu Zhe? That was simply because he had been the weakest member of the 7 king tiers. He was the easiest to possess, and thus he had been chosen. The king tiers were unable to accept this. They could die in battle, but dying like this, it was far too vexatious, and it was far too meaningless. However, whom could they complain to? The blue-skinned elite had died, and the netherworld elite had also been killed. Wu Zhe, the unfortunate victim of all this, had also died. The 6 king tiers remained silent for a long time. Only the yellow spring continued to crash through the sky. This river was formed from the corpse of an Eternal River tier elite, and it continued to flow even tens of millions of years after his death. It was as if it would flow for all eternity. At this moment, they all understood why this yellow spring felt so eerie and so harrowing. This was because it contained power from the netherworld. Let's explore the palace and see if we can obtain some more secret techniques, Shurangwa said. He was the first to break the silence. Everyone nodded in agreement. What was done, and the dead couldn't be brought back to life either. Moping over this matter wouldn't be of any help. They returned to the palace, where the light orbs still silently hovered in the air. However, these light orbs would still dash away when they tried to grab them, giving them no chance of obtaining the secret techniques inside. By the looks of it, their strength was insufficient to obtain these light orbs. As king tiers of the younger generation, Ling Han and the others naturally knew when to let things go. They resolutely turned around to leave. There were still many valuable items on the way out, such as godly medicines and perhaps some ancient techniques left in the ancient sites. Staying in the palace would be a complete waste of time. If they made their way to the entrance now, they would at least still obtain some treasures. It was just a matter of how much they obtained. After exiting the palace, they all turned around to take one final look. That was where Wu Zhe had died, though not a single scrap of his being was left. They all shook their head before leaving. After a long time, Ling Han released Xue Yanyu and Hu Feiyun from the Black Tower. When the old ginseng appeared, his expression was dark, and he said, "SH*TY brat, what kind of spatial tool is that? Why is it so freakish?" He had almost been planted, and he had almost had his awareness erased by the tool's spirit inside. In other words, he had almost become a godly medicine for consumption again. Not only that, but there was even an old divine tree inside, one that was far higher in grade than himself. He had no choice but to obediently call him Grandpa. Moreover, the divine sense of a saint was wrapped around a branch of the divine tree, and this person still terrified him, even though his might was already non-existent. Ling Han chuckled and asked, "Was it fun?" "Fun your mom. See how I stomp you to death. You actually dared to scare your grandpa." The old ginseng became angrier by the second, and he angrily launched a kick at Ling Han. Ling Han casually blocked his strikes. The old ginseng was simply venting his anger, and he wasn't genuinely having a falling out with Ling Han. Thus, he quickly stopped his attacks. "What a hot temper," Ling Han said with a smile. The old ginseng's eyes darted about, and he turned to Shui Yenyu, saying, "Beauty, want to change a partner? I'm definitely more useful than that brat. See, my entire body is exuding a treasured aura. Breathing in a lungful will increase your lifespan by 3 years and make you younger by 10 years. Ow!" Ling Han had hammered him on the head, and he instantly grabbed his head in pain. They returned the way they came, and they arrived before the medicinal mountain after just a few days. Ling Han started to undo the restrictions again, and they tried to harvest as much godly medicine as they could. However, undoing the restrictions took an extremely long time, and thus they were forced to set off again after obtaining just 2 godly medicines. They walked against the flow of the yellow spring, and they quickly arrived at the place where they had entered. This place was already brimming with people, as there were only 3 days left before the half-year time limit expired. People naturally came here a few days earlier because missing the exit date and being trapped inside this mystery realm meant death. "Master." Ding Ping was the first to run over. Mu Rongqing and the others followed after him. None of them had reached the consummate level of the mountain river tier, and thus none of them had gone to the Eagle Beak Mountain, and so on. Instead, they had deviated from this standard route and went elsewhere in search of their own opportunities. This allowed them to obtain quite a bountiful harvest. Second brother still hasn't returned," Ling Han said as he looked around. Out of those who had entered this mystery realm, only the Rain Emperor was still missing. Feng Piyin and the others all shook their heads. They had each gone their own way, and thus they didn't know what opportunities the Rain Emperor had come across, nor did they know what troubles he had encountered. With second brother's strength and willpower, he should be able to stay safe and escape even if he comes across dangerous situations, Ling Han said. He was confident in the Rain Emperor's abilities. Sister Shui, 9th King, why are you ladies also here?" Li Weiwei and Ji Yinner walked over at this moment. They were also disciples of the Majestic Heaven sect, so they could naturally enter this mystery realm as well. Ling Han hadn't revealed his identity to them yet, and thus they didn't know that he was Ling Han. They merely found it strange that Shui Yenyu and Hu Feiyun were in the company of an unfamiliar man. This was especially the case with Shui Yenyu. Hadn't she been all lovey-dovey with Ling Han? Perhaps she had dumped him after not seeing him for 3 years. That stupid blockhead. So pitiful. Shui Yenyu nodded at the 2 women. Hu Feiyun was much friendlier in comparison, and she immediately started to chatter with them. She was extremely young, so she naturally craved friends that were at a similar age to her. She wanted friends with whom she could share her grief and happiness. Fortunately, Hu Feiyun guarded the secret of Han Lin's identity, but this was probably because Li Weiwei and Ji Yunna hadn't asked. If they asked, Ling Han was almost certain that Hu Feiyun would spit out the truth. Ling Han didn't trust this ditzy woman to keep a secret. A day passed, and then 2. However, the Rain Emperor still didn't return. Ling Han and the others started to become anxious. There was only a day until the entrance to the mystery realm reopened, and they would all have to leave at that time. Otherwise, they would remain in this mystery realm forever. What on earth had the Rain Emperor come across? In this anxious atmosphere, the 3rd day rolled around. However, there was still no sign of the Rain Emperor. Wang. The air distorted, and a passageway silently appeared in the sky. They could vaguely see a giant ripping space apart with his hands. This giant was none other than Venerable Trinity. "It's time to leave." "Let's go." The cultivators started to stream out. However, there were quite a lot of people here, so they couldn't all leave at once. "Where's second brother? Why has he still not returned?" Mu Rongqing was pacing about in unease. Ling Han was also extremely worried. However, a thought suddenly flashed through his mind, and he said, "Perhaps second brother is the chosen one." What chosen one? Feng Piyin and the others asked. I entered the abode that belonged to the owner of this mystery realm, and he had left a dying note. He said that when the 7 stars align, 'tis the time my successor appears. The 7 stars referred to me, He Tao, and the others. It was us 7 who had opened the door to the palace. As for the latter half of that sentence, it's probably saying that the senior will choose a successor. I had initially thought that it would be one of the 7 king tiers. However, by the looks of it now, he probably chose someone else. It's extremely likely that he chose second brother. Chapter 1199, False Accusation. Chapter 1199, False Accusation. Second brother received the inheritance of an eternal river tier elite. Mu Rongqing instantly became excited, saying, that's definitely the case. With second brother's talents, he definitely has the right to receive such an inheritance. Feng Piyun also nodded slowly. He had to admit that the Rain Emperor was supremely talented. In fact, it was possible that he was as talented as Ling Han. That brat is fairly lucky, Helian Tianyin said in envy. Ling Han had speculated thusly to reassure himself and to give himself hope. Otherwise, he would lose his second brother forever. The cultivators continued to stream out, but Ling Han and the others still didn't leave. Although they suspected that the Rain Emperor had been chosen as a successor, they hadn't received any confirmation of this. As such, they weren't certain that this was the case, and thus they wanted to wait for a little longer. In the end, they were the only people still remaining in the mystery realm. Hurry up and come out! Venerable Trinity shouted. Why were these people idling about? Didn't they know that it was extremely burdensome to keep this passageway open, even for an eternal river tier elite like him? Ling Han nodded, and then left the mystery realm with the others. Show! The passageway instantly closed. Hurry up and leave, Venerable Trinity said. Understood. Venerable Trinity cleared the path for them as they speedily left the valley. When they made their way out, Venerable Trinity immediately left them and flew into the sky. He Tao, Shenjuer, Ling Han, a heavenly body tier called. These were the names of the 7 king tiers. Return to the sect as soon as possible and report to the 7 Rain Hall. Ling Han and the 5 other king tiers hurriedly accepted this command. However, Wu Zhe would remain in the mystery realm forever, and it would be impossible for him to return to the sect again. In any case, they understood that the Majestic Heaven sect was interested in the inheritances that they had obtained from the palace. The sect had long been aware that the door to the palace could only be opened by 7 king tiers. Thus, now that they had left the mystery realm, the sect would naturally summon them to ask about their gains. If the techniques they received were valuable enough, the sect would naturally make a copy of them. Everyone returned where they had come from, with the disciples of the Majestic Heaven sect returning to the Majestic Heaven sect. If one wasn't from the Majestic Heaven sect, they would return to wherever they cultivated or lived. This was the Death Valley, and there was nothing of worth apart from the Yellow Spring mystery realm there. People naturally didn't want to stick around this place for too long. Ling Han and the others didn't leave right away. They still wanted to wait for the Rain Emperor. However, 10 days passed, and there was still no sign of the Rain Emperor. Let's go. If second brother has truly obtained the inheritance, he'll naturally return when he masters his craft. Ling Han nodded after a brief moment of thought. Waiting here was pointless, and he had also received a command to return to the sect as quickly as possible. If this was a command from Venerable Trinity, even Empress Luanxing wouldn't be able to protect him if he arrived too late and offended him. They set off for the Majestic Heaven sect. They had the cloud-piercing shuttle, so their speed was incredibly quick. Although they had stayed at Death Valley for an extra 10 days, they only arrived at the sect 1 to 2 days later than everyone else. Ling Han immediately went to the 7 Rain Hall, a hall that was located on the cloud-piercing peak. However, he didn't see He Tao and the others when he reported his arrival and was summoned into the hall by a Sun Moon tier elite. They had either come already, or they still hadn't returned to the sect yet. "What secret technique did you obtain in that treasure storage?" the Sun Moon tier elite asked. By the looks of it, Shinjuer and the others had already reported to the Seven Rain Hall and recounted the events of the Mystery Realm. This wasn't strange. However, did they truly report the secret techniques that they had received? Or did they report some random cultivation technique to conceal the truth? Ling Han was slightly hesitant. Should I hand the star plucking step over? He had mulled over this movement technique while waiting at the Death Valley and returning to the sect. However, even though he had completed a dozen or so days of comprehension under the reincarnation tree, he still wasn't able to grasp it. In fact, he was still quite a distance away from being able to grasp it. From this fact alone, one could imagine just how high-grade this movement technique was. Should I hand it over for nothing? Rest assured, the sect won't take your secret technique for nothing. We'll definitely compensate you fairly, the Sun Moon tier elite said. Even if I want to hand over another secret technique to hide the star plucking step, there's nothing suitable. None of the 9 dragons' tyrant body art, annihilating dragon star arrow, and universal 8 desolation technique was necessarily less valuable than the star plucking step. In fact, they were perhaps even more valuable. Thus, he pondered for a moment before saying, I received a movement technique called the star plucking step. Write the secret technique out, the Sun Moon tier elite urged. We'll reward you based on its quality. Ling Han nodded, and then started to write the movement technique onto paper. After writing for a while, he was surprised to discover that a portion of the inheritance couldn't be written in words. It was something that could be understood, but not described. No amount of words or writing would be able to encapsulate it. However, if this portion was left out, the might of the movement technique would decrease dramatically. He was slightly taken aback. However, he immediately decided to let it go. He wasn't interested in the reward from the sect anyway. He continued to write, and it wasn't long before he finished. Done, the Sun Moon tier elite asked. He took the copy and immediately sealed it with a decree, not even flipping through it. The decree seal would make it easy to detect whether someone had read the copy before it reached its target recipient. You can leave now. You'll receive your reward once the grade of this movement technique is determined. Ling Han nodded and bowed respectfully before leaving. He was a very busy person. He had to study pill recipes, and he also had to practice movement techniques. Moreover, he was nearing the peak stage of the pinnacle level, and he would have to comprehend regulations of the Sun Moon tier after reaching it. This would definitely be time-consuming. He felt like there wasn't enough time. Ling Han cultivated earnestly in reclusion, comprehending pill recipes at times and practicing the star plucking step at others. Time slowly crept by. However, a hidden turbulence silently swirled through the sect, becoming more and more serious by the day. Gao Huang lodged a complaint to the sect, accusing Ling Han of wantonly killing fellow disciples and seizing thousand-source true fluid that originally belonged to the Gao faction. News of this had originally been confined to the higher-ups, with not many people aware of the complaint. However, it suddenly spread throughout the entire Majestic Heaven sect, and every single disciple was now aware of the situation. The sect instantly erupted in uproar. Killing fellow disciples was a massive taboo, and it was an action that would draw scorn and disdain. However, many disciples had witnessed the battle on the Eagle Beak Mountain and seen a portion of the truth. Ling Han had suppressed the masses and obtained 4 drops of thousand-source true fluid. As for whether the members of the Gao faction had died by Ling Han's hands, no one knew. This battle had occurred after the battle for the thousand-source true fluid, so no one had been around to witness it. Moreover, the Majestic Heaven sect had Sun Moon tier disciples in addition to Mountain River tier disciples, and only a portion of people had been at Eagle Beak Mountain to witness the battle. Rumors about Ling Han killing fellow disciples for thousand-source true fluid was swirling about, and after a while, these rumors gradually became the truth. Killing fellow disciples and stealing their treasures was an abhorrent act. Ling Han's rising reputation was instantly crushed, and many people expressed their disdain for him. Was such a person worthy of remaining in their sect? A growing number of voices called for Ling Han to be punished severely. Otherwise, the anger of the masses would be unsated. Chapter 1200 Analysis. Chapter 1200 Analysis. Ling Han generally stayed in the Black Tower and cultivated under the reincarnation tree, so he was naturally unaware of the huge commotion outside. It was only when he prepared to go to the Mo clan establishment to collect some pills and pay his debt that he was stopped by Shui Yinyu and informed of the situation. Them again. Ling Han said, a cold look in his eyes. This was the same as what had happened at the Chaotic Star's majestic empire. Zhao Luan had lodged a false accusation against him, and he had been put on a public trial by the army. Fortunately, the Empress had issued a decree that exonerated him. In fact, she had even seized the opportunity to execute a bunch of corrupt officials. However, due to the sensitivity of Zhao Luan's status, even the Empress hadn't dealt with him. This was partly because the matter hadn't been too serious. Moreover, there hadn't been a relationship between Ling Han and the Empress at that time. If such an event were to occur now, the Empress would probably deal with Zhao Luan swiftly and mercilessly. If Great General Zhao dared to oppose her, she would execute him along with his son. It wasn't as if she hadn't executed heavenly body tier generals before. However, this was the majestic heaven sect, and the Empress' influence couldn't reach this far. Even if she came over to help Ling Han, there was still a mountain-esque eternal river tier elite keeping watch over the sect. Who in this galaxy could challenge an eternal river tier elite? Ling Han humphed and said, "They're twisting the truth and completely fabricating stories." How shameless! He had obtained the 4 drops of thousand-source true fluid himself, and this was a fact that many people knew. Regarding the people from the Gao faction, it was Shi Ming who had chosen to unleash power at the Sun-Moon tier. However, his action had led to him being attacked and killed by the restriction of the Mystery Realm. Meanwhile, the other members of the group had been killed by the rain of blood and bones that had formed when Shi Ming exploded and died. He hadn't laid a single finger on them, yet they had put all of these deaths on his head. Gao Huang is such a shameless person. There was a cold glint in Ling Han's eyes. He had come across shameless people before, yet he had never come across someone as shameless and flagrant as Gao Huang. He had forcefully twisted the truth to fit his own narrative. Right now, the problem is that everyone in the sect is talking about how you massacred fellow disciples and stole their thousand-source true fluid, Shui Yinyu said anxiously. Ling Han shook his head and said, "There's no need to worry about the matter regarding the thousand-source true fluid. A great deal of people witnessed me obtaining it. Anyhow, who's willing to believe that the Gao faction can obtain 4 drops of thousand-source true fluid all by themselves?" Shui Yinyu nodded in realization. She had been extremely worried, so she hadn't been able to analyze the situation as calmly and clearly as Ling Han. The more pressing issue is the death of Shi Ming and the others. Ling Han rubbed his chin and continued, "After all, no one witnessed that battle. Even if someone did witness it, it's extremely likely that they're not a disciple of the majestic heaven sect. Thus, it's even more unlikely that they'll step forward to act as a witness for me. This was a vast galaxy with billions upon billions of people, so where would they find a witness if there was even one? Moreover, witnesses could be bought off. In terms of wealth, Ling Han was definitely no match for the entire Gao faction that had the support of a heavenly body tier elite. Although Shui Yinyu and Hu Feiyun had also witnessed the battle, They had extremely close relationships with Ling Han. Thus, even if they offered witness statements, they would merely be dismissed as biased toward Ling Han. Anyhow, being as shameless as Gao Huang is, he'll probably find a few people to pose as witnesses. They'll claim that they personally saw me killing those Gao faction members. Ling Han speculated what kinds of methods Gao Huang might use. What can we do? Shui Yinyu asked anxiously. This was the Majestic Heaven sect, so the Gao faction was definitely very influential. Ling Han pondered for a moment before saying, "Even the Gao faction can't shut out the heavens with one hand. This is the Majestic Heaven sect, after all, not the Gao faction. However, whether or not this matter can be resolved depends on whether the other 8 factions are willing to weigh in on it. It also depends on Venerable Trinity's attitude." Shui Yenyu composed herself and also started to analyze the situation, saying, "Venerable Trinity has 9 disciples in total, and each has their own faction. Out of the other 8 factions, there are definitely a few that are hostile to the Gao faction. We don't need all of them, and we'll be able to resist the Gao faction if just one of them is willing to help." "Correct. However, why should they help us? What's in it for them?" Ling Han smiled and said, "They're not my wives, so they're not always thinking about what's in my best interests." He pulled Shui Yenyu into an embrace. He had been busy with cultivation and comprehension these past few days, so he hadn't had a chance to show love to this bewitching beauty. Now that her soft and shapely body was pressed against him, he couldn't help but feel aroused. Shui Yenyu felt a little annoyed, and she naturally blamed Ling Han for being so heartless he had ignored her for an entire fortnight. However, he had actually become aroused at this moment. She truly didn't know what to say. "Come, it's only right that we discuss important matters in bed." After some passionate love-making, Ling Han embraced Shui Yenyu in satisfaction and said, "Everyone knows that I obtained a few drops of 1,000-source true fluid. If I want to seek help from any of the other factions, they'll probably ask for 1,000-source true fluid in return." Shui Yenyu nodded and said, "Gao Huang is probably trying to force you into submission as well. He wants you to willingly hand him the 1,000-source true fluid. Even though I've got yet to meet him, his actions reveal that he's a cold-blooded person. He doesn't give a toss about his subordinates' lives, as long as they can fulfill his goals." Ling Han humphed and said, "Right now he's stuck at the peak stage of the Sun-Moon tier. If he doesn't obtain any 1,000-source true fluid, he might need over 1,000,000 years to reach the heavenly body tier. In fact, there's a possibility that he'll be stuck at the Sun-Moon tier forever. So, he'll definitely do everything he can to snatch your 1,000-source true fluid." Shui Yenyu exclaimed in astonishment. Ling Han chuckled coldly and said, "He's truly a wild dog. I'll need to up my guard, or it really will be troublesome if I'm bitten by him." "Can't he wait for next time?" Shui Yenyu asked in irritation. Ling Han shook his head and said, "How can a despicable person like him keep his calm after seeing 4 drops of 1,000-source true fluid placed in front of him? Moreover, even though I'm a seed, I've come to the immortal realm from a small world. In other words, I'm the easiest to pick on." The other 5 king tiers had each obtained a drop of 1,000-source true fluid as well, meaning Gao Huang would be able to obtain another 5 drops if he were able to force all of them to give their drop up. This would be more than what Ling Han had. 9 drops of 1,000-source true fluid was better than 4, right? It would definitely increase his chance of breaking through to the heavenly body tier. So, why didn't he target Shinjur and the others? This was because their background was too powerful. Gao Huang was merely afraid of offending them. "But doesn't the Empress hold you in high regard?" Shui Yenyu asked. She struggled to come up with words to describe their relationship. The relationship between Ling Han and the Empress was very fuzzy, after all. Although the Empress helped me before, everyone thought that she had left a spiritual mark on the 9th King's body. They thought that the 9th King had asked her for help, Ling Han said. This made a world of difference. If the heavenly body tier elite didn't want to help Ling Han, Gao Huang would only have to face the ninth king. If that were the case, what would he need to be afraid of? Even if they did want help, they would both have heavenly body tier elites supporting them. Moreover, it was clear that Gao Feng, who had an Eternal River tier master, was more impressive. So you're saying that we have to deal with this ourselves? Shui Yinyu asked uneasily. Ling Han nodded, and then said, "Don't worry, if they truly piss me off, I'll chuck Notionless Saint out. Although he's lost his saintly might, he was once a saint, after all. Using him to frighten people should be fine." Shui Yinyu nodded and finally felt a little more at ease. However, Ling Han knew that he wouldn't be able to use Notionless Saint. He had already refined his own saintly might for his future disciple. So how could he deter Eternal River tier elites? In fact, could he even deter Heavenly Body tier elites? He had only said this to reassure Shui Yinyu. Chapter 1201 Conflict. Chapter 1201 Conflict. Ling Han decided to roll with the punches. Although the sect was flooded with rumors that demonized him, those who were objective and intelligent would be able to see through them easily. Ling Han believed that those who were talented enough to enter the Majestic Heaven sect were all relatively smart people. Thus, such rumors would eventually run out of steam. He still went to the Mo clan establishment as planned, and he sold them a large number of alchemical pills. He also made a copy of a pill recipe. It was an ancient recipe, and it was very likely that it was already lost in the outside world. Thus, he could probably sell it for a good price. Regarding the 1,000-source true fluid, he decided to sell it as well. "Don't you really want these, Gao Huang? Well, I'm not going to give them to you, and I'm even going to make you lose face." Ling Han genuinely didn't need these 4 drops of 1,000-source true fluid. They could aid one's comprehension, but they couldn't increase one's cultivation level. Cultivating under the reincarnation tree couldn't improve one's comprehension, but this could be made up for with time. Perhaps 1 or 2 days of comprehension wouldn't be enough. But what about 8 or 10 years of comprehension? In a sense, the reincarnation tree had similar effects to 1,000-source true fluid. Moreover, its beneficial effects could be used endlessly. Thus, Ling Han naturally wanted to sell his 4 drops of 1,000-source true fluid. That way, he could increase his wealth and purchase more godly metal to raise the grade of his divine demon sword. Anyhow, Ling Han was destined to be a poor sod before he evolved the material of his divine demon sword to divine metal. All of his money would be spent on the divine demon sword. However, the might of his divine demon sword was already starting to show itself. It possessed a battle prowess that was no weaker than his. No matter how much he spent, this sword was worth the cost. Han Hua was stunned upon hearing Ling Han's offer. He then happily agreed and started to discuss the fine details with him. He decided to hold an auction, and the items for auction were naturally the 1,000-source true fluid, ancient pill recipe, and alchemical pills that Ling Han provided. 1,000-source true fluid and ancient pill recipes were all very valuable items, and thus it made sense to maximize their selling price by holding an auction. As for alchemical pills, they would definitely sell for more thanks to the influence of the other more valuable items. Those who did business were indeed more skilled at these kinds of things. Han Hua had taken far more things into consideration than Ling Han. Ling Han nodded in approval and let Han Hua deal with the remaining matters. Meanwhile, he returned to the Majestic Heaven sect. He still had to practice the star plucking step and study the new pill recipes. He arrived at his palace, only to see the old ginseng talking and joking with Li Weiwei and Ji Yinner. He was massaging their shoulders, and a strand of his roots stealthily slid into each of their collars, looking for beautiful landmarks. This perverted ginseng is beyond help. Although you're in a humanoid form, you're only as large a child's arm. What can you do? Ling Han shook his head as he thought this. Anyhow, What had Li Weiwei and Ji Yuner come for? Damn, blockhead. You actually dared to keep me in the dark. Li Weiwei immediately jumped to her feet upon seeing Ling Han enter. This caused the old ginseng to grimace in pain. One of his roots had been on her chest, and he hadn't been able to pull it back in time. Thus, it was ruthlessly snapped when she jumped up. Li Weiwei didn't realize it, yet Ling Han saw it clearly. He secretly smiled to himself. Who told the old ginseng to act so perverted? Anyhow, this root would be good compensation for Li Weiwei. The roots of this old ginseng were extremely nutritious. Ling Han had only taken one to eat, and he had left the others stored on the old ginseng. Li Weiwei had unknowingly obtained one now, and it would definitely be extremely beneficial to her cultivation and physique. Ling Han smiled and said, "How did you find out?" "Hee, I didn't believe that Sister Shui was the type of person who'd cheat. So, I kept pestering the Ninth King with questions. It didn't take long for her to spill the beans," Li Weiwei said smugly. Sure enough, Hu Feiyun couldn't keep any secrets. She was a clone of Empress Luanxing, and her personality was one that was severed from the Empress. Thus, it was inevitable that there would be some deficiencies in her personality. Meanwhile, some of her other traits would be magnified significantly. For example, the innocence and ditziness of Hu Feiyun were both traits that had been severed from Empress Luanxing. These had only been a tiny portion of the Empress personality, yet they were the entirety of Hu Feiyun's. "Blockhead, how are you planning to respond? Everyone's talking about how you killed fellow disciples and stole their treasures." Li Weiwei quickly moved on from how Ling Han had kept his identity hidden and instead started to worry for him. Ling Han smiled and said, "It's fine. I'll deal with whatever gets thrown my way." "What can't I deal with?" "What a bold claim," Li Weiwei said with a humph. However, she felt much more reassured after seeing Ling Han's oozing confidence. Ling Han had come from the chaotic star's majestic empire, after all, and he had come across all kinds of dangers. However, he had overcome all of them. Feng Puyin, Ding Ping, and the others also came to visit him. However, they were all reassured and sent away by Ling Han. He would deal with this matter himself. However, he couldn't find any time to cultivate in the following several days, with Xiao Sisi, Xiao Wuk, Su Jing, and the others all visiting him. They all hinted at their willingness to help him as long as he joined their forces. If he agreed to join, they would do everything in their ability to help him. Ling Han smiled and turned down their goodwill. He had no plans to join any forces. Why was he cultivating so earnestly? Wasn't it to attain true freedom so he could do what he wanted? Afterward, He Tao and the other king tiers also came to visit him. Their offers were similar to those of Xiao Sisi and the others, and they all hoped that Ling Han could join their forces. A significant reason for this was Ling Han's non-existent background. He had come from a small world after opening the sky, and thus he had absolutely no background in the immortal realm. As such, they didn't need to worry about him being a spy for some other force. Ling Han naturally turned down their offers as well. It was also around this time that a piece of news suddenly started to spread. The sect was apparently discussing the matter regarding Ling Han killing his fellow disciples. There was potentially going to be a public trial in a few days. Gao Huang was finally making his move. On the same night that this news broke, a Sun Moon tier elite appeared before Ling Han's palace. "I'm Zhou Tong." This Sun Moon tier elite looked to be around 30 years old, and it was clear that he had already formed 2 suns and moons. His strength was fairly formidable. There was a haughty look on his face, and he said, "I've come at the command of young master to give you one final chance. Immediately hand the 4 drops of thousand source true fluid over. Otherwise, you'll become an unforgivable traitor of the sect. You'll be pinned to the post of humiliation forever." Ling Han smiled and said, "You could have chosen to be a respectable Sun Moon tier elite. But no, you had to choose the life of a dog. How dare you?" Zhou Tong exploded in rage, and divine flames instantly erupted from his body. Ling Han waved his hand and said, "Don't get all angry at me. You've merely cultivated for a few 100,000 years. More than me. You want to make a bet? I'll be powerful enough to crush you in 10 years' time." Ling Han's words were extremely bold and domineering. A mountain river tier cultivator was claiming that they would possess the ability to crush a sun-moon tier elite in 10 years' time. Who could believe this? However, Zhou Tong's pupils contracted when he heard this. Judging by the freakish nature of this brat, it was genuinely possible that he could achieve this. Anyhow, he didn't believe this claim too much. He humphed and said, "If you don't hand the 1,000-source true fluid over, you won't even be able to overcome the challenge before you. That being the case, what future is there for you to speak of?" Ling Han smiled calmly. He had the pill recipe for the Berserk Blood Spirit pill, and he also had a Red Rain Divine King tree in his Black Tower. Thus, he would be able to refine a great deal of Berserk Blood Spirit pills once he reached the Sun-Moon tier. One could envisage that he would improve in leaps and bounds during a certain period of time. Go back and tell Gao Huang that if he wants my 1,000-source true fluid, he can prepare enough true origin stones and attend the auction that occurs in 3 months' time, Ling Han said. This was a good opportunity to advertise the auction. Chapter 1202. The Hua faction makes their move. Chapter 1202. The Hua faction makes their move. Zhou Tong left, bringing with him fury and Ling Han's answer. As a great elite of Sun-Moon tier, he was actually threatened up front by a mountain river tier. This made him very displeased. But who asked him to come up himself and offer himself up to be insulted? If he reported this to the sect, it would only be disadvantageous to him. As long as Ling Han was a seed, he was not someone that could be lightly insulted. The news that the Mo clan establishment would be auctioning off the 1,000-source true fluid very soon caused a commotion, and this auction had also obtained the full support of the Mo clan. They had mobilized the full power of the clan to advertise this matter. Thus, very soon, the news had spread all over the entire galaxy. Even a great many elites of heavenly body tier were attracted. The 1,000-source true fluid was formed from an elite of the eternal river tier, containing comprehension of the heaven and earth of this level. Even for heavenly body tiers, this was a precious treasure. It might not be able to make a cultivator at the peak stage of the heavenly body tier break through to the eternal river tier, but it was still very possible for it to help one in the low extreme of the heavenly body tier to break through to the medium extreme, or one in the medium extreme to advance into the high extreme, and so on. And what did this kind of advancement mean? A revolutionary change would take place in one's abilities, and his lifespan would also be increased by another 10 million years. 10 million years. With such a long period of time, perhaps he could obtain a new fated opportunity and advance into a higher cultivation level. Thus, not only sun-moon tiers were moved, even a great many heavenly body tiers had begun to set out towards Flying Cloud Planet. This was also the reason why the auction was scheduled for 3 months later. It was to allow enough time for the bankrollers to come. Of course, the Mo clan had also invited some alchemists. This group was the true rich group. For the sake of an ancient pill recipe, they would definitely place a high bid that would make one gape in shock. Ling Han did not need to do anything. He had already delegated the full responsibility for arranging the auction to Han Hua. He would only have to hand over the 1,000-source true fluid and other items over to Han Hua on the day of the auction. Did not hand them over yet, because the goods would be safest with Ling Han. Because of how valuable the 1,000-source true fluid was, the auction had instantly become the hottest topic of conversation. However, the movement from the Gao faction was also getting bigger and bigger. Obviously, they were planning to subdue Ling Han before the auction itself. Otherwise, if the goods were already on the stage of the auction, they could only compete with their wealth. However, the Majestic Heaven sect was not a place that the Gao faction had full control of. Senior Brother Han, On this night, a guest came to pay him a visit. Fan Rue led the guest in. She was an enchanting and exquisite beauty, with a voluptuous figure and so bewitching that she could have been dripping water. She curtsied to Ling Han and said, "I am Ji Yunji, Junior's sister Ji. What is it?" Ling Han asked casually, as if he had completely not realized that the person standing in front of him was a vixen that could make anyone's heart throb and face blush. Fan Rue, who was standing on the sidelines, dared not look directly at Ji Yunji, afraid that even his spirit would be hooked. Ji Yunji was surprised. She was naturally very clear how enchanting she was. This was not only because she was naturally beautiful, and had also deliberately gone the route of becoming more seductive later. It was also because the cultivation technique she was cultivating would allow her to be even more dazzling and bewitching. Every move she made would be exuding seduction. But Ling Han actually did not even look at her directly, which was something she could not accept. Usually, men would want nothing more than to have their eyes glued to her. But Ling Han was the complete opposite. He seemed too lazy to even cast a second look on her. She calmed herself and said, "I am here by command of Hua Yangwu and young Master Hua, hoping to ask for a small favor from Brother Ling, and see if you could sell a drop of 1,000-source true fluid to the Hua faction." Hua faction? Ling Han gave an O. After he had made an enemy of the Gao faction, he had conducted his own investigation, and knew that there was a disciple called Hua Yongning who was ranked 6th among Venerable Trinity's 9 disciples. Then, this Hua faction was naturally formed by Hua Yongning. Additionally, Gao Fong was ranked 4th among the 9 disciples. Though this was only in the order in which they took him as master, in a certain way, it was also the power ranking of their respective factions. Young master would definitely not allow senior brother Ling to make a loss. Ji Yunji smiled sweetly. What young master means is senior brother Ling needs only auction off 3 drops of 1,000-source true fluid, and young master would purchase a drop at the same price as the lowest successful bid among these 3 drops. This indeed could not be considered a loss to Ling Han, because if the 4 drops of 1,000-source true fluid were really auctioned off together, then the cheapest drop might be sold lower than the lowest successful bid in the case of 3 drops being auctioned off together. After all, the smaller the supply, the fiercer the competition would be. For my sake, the Hua faction would turn hostile with the Gao faction? Ling Han asked. Any faction is filled with competition. As the saying goes, the weak are prey to the strong, and survival of the fittest reigns supreme. Ji Yunji said calmly. Among the Venerable's 9 disciples, only one would be able to obtain the final true inheritance and shoulder the great responsibility of leading the majestic heaven sect. So, even if it is not for the sake of senior brother Han, the battle between the Hua faction and Gao faction is inevitable. Ling Han nodded. The lower ranks had their own competition, and the upper ranks would also have the struggle of the upper ranks. How much envy would the inheritance of Eternal River Tear garner? If one obtained it, he might perhaps be capable of conquering this whole universe and become the only ruler. How many people would be able to resist this kind of temptation? No wonder those 9 disciples all formed their respective factions. Their aim was to increase their own stakes so they could obtain the inheritance. However, Venerable Trinity had not made his stand clear all this while, and even had plans to take Yang Hao as his 10th disciple. This was actually giving off the signal that Venerable Trinity was not very satisfied with these 9 disciples. Even though the 9 disciples were all fighting fiercely now, when the time came, it could be completely wasted effort, and they wouldn't be getting anything. Ling Han smiled. What relation did this have with him? He pondered for a moment, and then said, "All right. I can retain a drop of 1,000-source true fluid for young Master Hua." In any case, it was no loss to him. Senior brother Han is truly a man of firm temperament. I shall first offer my thanks on behalf of young Master. Ji Yunji stood up and curtsied again to Ling Han. Her head and neck was low, revealing the snow white of her breasts. The part that swelled was voluptuous and grand. What a seductive beauty that could ignite flames! Ling Han's expression was serene, constantly being seduced by a great vixen like Shui Yanyu. He had naturally gained a strong immunity. Furthermore, in comparison with the exquisite beauty and charm of Empress Luanxing, Ji Yunji was only on the level of a village girl. How could he possibly be disturbed? Ji Yunji raised her head, and when she saw that Ling Han's expression was calm, without the slightest sign of his heart beating faster or being breathless in excitement, she couldn't help but feel extremely curious. According to her understanding, Ling Han should have reacted by now and embarrassed himself and become obedient in front of her. Then she would be able to get the upper hand psychologically. If she then set out some conditions, Ling Han would agree without the slightest hesitation due to his flustered state. Did this guy not like women? Ji Yunji was making her guesses internally, but it was naturally impossible that she would ask this question out loud. She continued talking and took advantage of the opportunity to seduce Ling Han a few more times, but all her attempts ended in failure. Thus, she could only leave helplessly. What nice breasts! Old Ginseng popped up from who knew where, looking like it was gritting its teeth at Ling Han. That little asterisk was obviously seducing you, so why didn't you just take her? Even if you wouldn't, you should still have had her take off her clothes so you could allow this Grandpa Ginseng to have an eyeful. Get lost! Ling Han shot out a kick. This perverted Ginseng was definitely incurable. Chapter 1203, Turning Hostile. Chapter 1203, Turning Hostile. The Hua faction had great power. From the second day onwards, there were already people talking about the truth on the Eagle's Beak Mountain, about how Ling Han had obtained 4 drops of 1,000-source true fluid all by himself and created history. In truth, this was something that had been talked about long ago, but it had immediately been buried underneath the public opinion that was universally against Ling Han. However, now with the Hua faction moving, it was like how the Gao faction had easily presented Ling Han as an executioner who killed others to steal their treasure, having as much impact on the people as the previous rumor. The vast power of the Hua faction was naturally not something that could be matched by any individual entity. Even when such young king tiers like He Tao and Shen Juder spoke up, it was useless. How could they match the force that had been nurtured for tens of thousands of years by the Hua faction and Gao faction? Now that the Hua faction and Gao faction had started their contention, it was naturally impossible that the public opinion would be so one-sided anymore. Instead, it was the clash of 2 voices. One was smearing Ling Han's reputation, whereas the other was establishing a positive image of Ling Han. What the truth was actually not important. What was important was which of these 2 factions was stronger. Unexpectedly, a new faction very soon joined in. The Hu faction. The founder of the Hu faction was the 9th disciple of the Venerable Trinity. His name was Hu Xiangdi. He did not have any children, and the young master of the Hu faction was his only disciple. Her name was Lei Linglong, an outstanding beauty. The Hu faction's inclination was to beat down on Ling Han. Actually, by now, Ling Han's matter was no longer important. This had become a stage for the disciples of the Venerable Trinity to show off their power. They were all fighting over the only qualification to obtain the true inheritance, and all wanted to trample over the others. Or, in other words, they were making use of this matter to kick a few people out of their way. Ling Han was a fuse, and the joining in of the Hua faction had announced the beginning of this battle. Next, more disciples of the Venerable Trinity joined in. The Tai faction, Lang faction, Nya faction, Jian faction, Lu faction. Out of the 9 great disciple, 8 disciples had already joined in, and now the situation just happened to be 4 against 4. Now, it was the only remaining Chu faction that had yet to make their position clear. Who would have thought that a mere mountain river tier disciple would actually be capable of triggering a fierce battle among the 9 great disciples, and that they would display their respective abilities. But the Hua faction's condition had also changed. Previously, the condition that Ji Yunji had set out on behalf of the Hua faction was being willing to spend an exorbitant amount to purchase a drop of thousand-source true fluid, and in exchange they would help Ling Han dissolve the oppression from the Gao faction. But when the Tai faction, Nye faction, and Lu faction also joined into the alliance, Ji Yunji came to see Ling Han again. Apologies. To oppose the alliance of the Gao, Lang, Jiang, and Hu factions, young master was forced to pull in the other 3 factions for help, but they could not possibly offer their aid for no reason. Ji Yunji smiled apologetically. Young master said that we hoped that senior brother Han could take out all 4 drops of thousand-source true fluid. Seeing Ling Han's expression darken, she hurriedly continued, naturally, young master would not treat senior brother Han badly. We can purchase it at 1 million true origin stones per drop. Are you committing burglary? Ling Han almost laughed out loud. Previously, when he had been selling alchemical pills at the Chaotic Star's Majestic Empire, he had earned more than 2 million true origin stones, and now, a drop of thousand-source true fluid could actually only sell for 1 million. This was a treasure that even heavenly body tiers would prize greatly. Your young master is a real joker. Ling Han shook his head. He finally understood. What Hua faction and Gao faction? In truth, they were no different, was just a dogfight. And he had actually placed his hopes on the Hua faction. He had really been too naive. Ji Yunji was also feeling guilty. But how could she possibly not do as young master commanded? She stretched out a hand to press down on Ling Han's palm and said, Senior brother Han, young master Hua will use other means to compensate you. Ling Han withdrew his hand and said, Hee, please keep a respectable distance, junior sister Ji. I, too, shall offer you a word of advice. A man that can treat you like an item to be freely gifted. Would he really be worth entrusting your whole life to? Ji Yunji's beautiful face couldn't help but shift expressions drastically. Hua Yongwen had commanded that she could sacrifice some of her charms as the situation required to placate Ling Han. In her heart, she was naturally unwilling, but she dared not disobey his command. Now that Ling Han had pointed it out openly, she almost wanted to die in her fury and shame. There is no need for senior brother Han to worry about my matters, she said coldly. Just one word. If you hand over the thousand-source true fluid, you can obtain me. Undress, undress, undress. Old Ginseng suddenly popped out. This guy's eyes was already shining brightly. When he heard such seductive words, how could he possibly continue resisting? He had scrambled out from who knows where. Girl, take off your clothes first, and let Grandpa Ginseng examine you. Get lost. Ling Han shot out a foot, and old Ginseng was instantly sent flying. Ah, old Ginseng screamed out. Brat, you are kicking me to the curb when I'm no longer useful. You are having the lion's share, so can't you save some scraps for Grandpa Ginseng? A man cannot be so disloyal, you petty brat. You hide all the good stuff for yourself. Grandpa Ginseng *** you. A muscle twitched involuntarily in Ji Yunji's cheek. And what the heck was this? Ling Han waved his hand dismissively and said, Go back, and you won't have to come again in future. Since young Master Hua is insincere, then our previous agreement will be completely considered nullified. Senior brother Han. A sinister expression appeared on Ji Yunji's face. Since you have already offended the Gao faction, if you continue to offend our Hua faction, you would progress with great difficulty within the sect. Hee, you speak as if the whole world belongs to you guys, Ling Han said carelessly. If you speak a few less words now, I will only detest the Hua faction at most. But if you continue to garner my dislike, the Hua faction will also be on my list of future targets. I can also offer you a warning. Those listed on my list of targets definitely will not reap any nice fruits. A confident smile appeared on his face. There would be a day when he would stride over the heavenly body tier to become eternal river tier. And by then, even if Venerable Trinity moved, he would not be able to stop him from seeking justice from the so-called Gao faction and Hua faction. He, the Rain Emperor, Feng Piyin Dingping, which one of them was not a genius in his own right. As long as they were given enough time, they would even be able to punch a hole in the heavens. They should not take unfair advantage of him just because of his youth. Ji Yunji couldn't help but yield in the face of Ling Han's forcefulness. After a long while, she finally said, "Since Senior Brother Han is obstinately clinging to his own course, I will report this to young master as it is." "Excuse me." She turned and left. Since their negotiation had soured, there was naturally nothing else that needed to be said. It would only cause their relations to become even worse. "Brat, you are practically too stupid. Since there was a girl that willingly offered to take off her clothes, why didn't you just go ahead?" Old Ginseng ran back, a perverted expression all over his face. Ling Han sighed and said, "You have really reincarnated into the wrong body. Since you love to watch people undress so much, why don't you go and stay at the public baths?" He 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 he. The old Ginseng released a series of mischievous snicker. "How do you know that Grandpa Ginseng hasn't gone there?" "Fuck this perverted Ginseng." Ling Han shook his head, too lazy to squabble with him. Now that he had also pushed out the Hua faction, then even if the Hua faction and the other factions did not fall in with the Gao faction, there were still as many as 4 factions targeting Ling Han. Now that things had come so far, the arrow was already notched. No matter if Ling Han had committed a crime or not, they would all have to crucify Ling Han. Otherwise, the 4 factions would all lose face. One Gao faction was already capable of suppressing Ling Han to the point of suffocation. What more when there were now 4 factions? Chapter 1204, Day of the Auction. Chapter 1204, Day of the Auction. There were still 47 days until the auction. Obviously, the Gao faction would definitely not allow the auction to proceed, because once the 1,000-source true fluid had been auctioned off, the buyer would either be an elite of the heavenly body tier or a force that had the backing of one. No ordinary person would have that kind of wealth. And in the face of elites of the heavenly body tier, the Gao faction would firstly be too embarrassed to try to snatch the treasure, and secondly, they might not be successful either, unless Venerable Trinity moved personally. But if Venerable Trinity had been willing to move, there wouldn't have been an auction in the first place. Hence, the Gao faction would definitely have to rush against time to deal with Ling Han before the auction started. In that case, the 1,000-source true fluid would be theirs. As for how the 4 drops of 1,000-source true fluid were to be divided, and how Ling Han would be finally dealt with, that was their internal business. In short, they had to first snatch the 1,000-source true fluid. These few days, I have already discovered that there are people keeping a surveillance in secret. Looks like the Gao faction is finally going to make a true killing move. No need for a few days, and the sect would put me on trial. Though this seems like farce to me, this is a world where only the strong rule in the first place. Now that the Hua faction has shrunk back, unless Venerable Trinity spoke up, this battle would not be easily fought. Ling Han was pondering deeply. Even he had not foreseen that things would have progressed to this level. At the time, he had only given his full effort in battle just for the sake of safeguarding his own treasure. He had not predicted that this would have given the Gao faction an opening to raise difficult questions and place the deaths of Shi Ming and the others on his account as well. Though this matter was indeed slightly related to him, it had been the Gao faction provoking him in the first place. It couldn't possibly be that since you were about to rob me, I would have to smilingly surrender my treasure, right? Then what was the point of cultivation? He might as well just become a coward. Though that's the fact, how should I actually survive this ordeal? Ling Han considered for a very long time and finally came to a decision. no matter if it is the Gao faction or the Hua faction. What they want is the thousand-source true fluid. Then, from this day onwards, I will stay in the Black Tower and not come out. I will drag it out all the way until the day of the auction, when I will rid myself of the thousand-source true fluid. Then the pressure I face would be considerably smaller. Perhaps only Gao Huang would be biting at me at that time like a mad dog. Ho ho, Gao Huang, though we have never met, you should be very honored to become the first person that I want to kill before even meeting him. Ling Han smirked coldly. He was forced so far that he could only stay in the Black Tower for his own safety. Naturally, he was furious. After sending Fan Ru off to Hu Feiyun's, Ling Han informed Ding Ping, Feng Piyin, Shui Yanyu, and the others, telling them not to come and look for him these few days. Then he entered into the Black Tower and continued to cultivate the star-plucking step. However, 2 days later, the Gao faction could no longer bear it and used a killing move. They summoned Ling Han for a trial to investigate the truth behind the deaths of Shi Ming and the others. Yet Ling Han had disappeared. This move caught the Gao faction unprepared. They searched Ling Han's quarters thoroughly in the name of the sect rules, yet they still did not manage to find him. This drove them crazy. To prevent Ling Han from fleeing, they had already had people stand guard at the doors. As soon as Ling Han left, they would be putting him under surveillance. Yet the person who was on surveillance duty solemnly vowed that Ling Han had definitely not left the palace. But where was he now? How had he disappeared? Ling Han had not been sentenced yet. Thus, as a seed, he could naturally come and go as he pleased. This was not against the rules of the sect. Hence, the Gao faction could not treat Ling Han as a criminal and stick up wanted posters for him everywhere. This was extremely interesting. To list Ling Han as a wanted criminal, they had to first prove that he had committed a crime. Yet Ling Han did not appear, so the trial could not be carried out. Then he was innocent, and this was a complete cycle. Thus, the Gao faction could only mobilize their own forces to search for Ling Han in secret. The other factions might also have joined in as well, but they ultimately could not command the whole sect and launch a search on a greater scale. Meanwhile, Ling Han was leisurely cultivating in the Black Tower. He had enough alchemical pills and true origin stones. Even if he was in the Black Tower, it did not affect his accumulation of origin power, and as he underwent comprehension underneath the reincarnation tree, it was natural that his grasp of the regulations of this heaven and earth would be greatly improved day by day. When the day that the auction would begin came, Ling Han quietly advanced into the peak stage of the pinnacle level of the mountain river tier, and had become qualified to become a match for an opponent in the low extreme of the sun-moon tier. I have never been this powerful before, he murmured to himself. No wonder Shinjuer and the others had been so confident previously. If they had exhibited their full power, they could have indeed suppressed him easily. Of course, suppressing him was one matter, and wounding him was another. As for the star-plucking step, I have also grasped a bit of it. Cooperating with the present level of my origin power, I can definitely experience a short burst of speed that would surpass the majority of sun-moon tiers. It's time to go to the auction. He exited the Black Tower, calmly opened the doors, and came out. Pooh! Seeing him suddenly appear, the eyes of the person in charge of surveillance outside almost popped out. Even his brain short-circuited. They were keeping a watch here, but it was merely routine business. After all, they had searched the palace a considerable number of times before. Who would have thought that Ling Han would actually come out from inside? When they saw Ling Han, they only felt as if they had seen a monster. Thus, it was only when Ling Han had walked quite some distance away that they came back to themselves and shouted, "Stop right there!" Ling Han smiled. "Just because you said so." Not only did he not stop, he instead ran even faster. "Quick! Send out a signal quickly. We've found Han Lin," one of the people on watch duty said. The other person nodded hurriedly and drew out a signal bomb. Pa! A Gao letter instantly appeared in the skies. This was the unique communication method of the Gao faction. Suddenly, elites of the Sun Moon tier appeared and quickly rushed over. Additionally, there were even more mountain river tiers that had rushed here. However, they were much slower. When they found out that Ling Han had appeared, they were both pleased and shocked. Their pleasure was because Ling Han had finally appeared, and their shock was due to the fact that today was the day of the auction. This brat must be rushing to deliver the goods to the auction. Cut him off. Old you will move separately. I will pursue by following the traces of that brat while you head directly for the auction, an elite of Sun Moon tier said. All right. The other person nodded. Two great elites of the Sun Moon tier were moving separately. They had absolute confidence that whichever of them moved, they would be able to easily subdue Ling Han. The one in pursuit of Ling Han was precisely Zhu Tianqiu. Previously, he had experienced a loss in Ling Han's hands in secret, so he would naturally bear a grudge against Ling Han. He wanted to apprehend Ling Han personally and put him in a little bit of suffering first. Zhu Tianqiu's speed was extremely fast, though Ling Han circled and turned here and there, attempting to hide the traces. How powerful were the senses of the Sun Moon tier! He pursued him the whole way, and in a short while he could already catch sight of Ling Han's back. Ha 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 ha! Han Lin, there is no way you can flee, he declared wickedly. Ho ho, you are threatening me again. Have you forgotten the lesson from last time? Ling Han asked smilingly. Zhu Tianqiu almost exploded in anger. This brat actually dared to still speak of the matter from previously? He released a furious roar, and his feet suddenly sped up as he raced towards Ling Han. Brat, don't even think of running away this time. That may not be the case. Ling Han sped up as well. He burst into a terrifying speed, which was actually not the slightest bit slower than Zhu Tianqiu's. Star Plucking Step. Chapter 1205 Failure? Chapter 1205 Failure. Zhu Tianqiu was astonished. Ling Han was merely in the mountain river tier, yet the burst of speed actually made him faster than even him. Was this possible? However, even if he didn't want to, he had to believe this. Not only did the gap between himself and Ling Han not shorten, it was instead widening endlessly. So fortunate, he thought. Previously, it had indeed been wise of him to have the other person stand guard to wait for Ling Han at the auction grounds. Otherwise, the two of them would only be able to sigh helplessly as they followed Ling Han, fruitlessly. Yet Ling Han knew he would not be able to maintain such speed for long. This was a little like the ultimate arrow, though it was not as exaggerated. For a short time he could burst with a terrifyingly fast speed, and he could maintain this kind of high speed more or less for about 6 or 7 minutes. And this was taking into account the fact that he had not completely grasped the star plucking step. If he could completely understand the true essence of this movement technique, the burst of speed would be even greater. Soon enough, Ling Han's speed had decreased. However, he had already arrived at the foot of the mountain, and the small town had appeared in front of him. There was just a little bit of distance he had to cover. Han Lin, will you still not halt? A cold hum sounded, and a Sun Moon tier elite appeared, standing in Ling Han's path like a god descended. Whether I halt or not, what relation does that have with you? Ling Han's figure flashed, intending to make a turn and pass. What a joke. You see, am standing guard here, and you still think you can pass? This Sun Moon tier smirked coldly, stretching out a hand to grab Ling Han. He was in the late stage of the low extreme of the Sun Moon tier. As he delivered this attack, a sun and moon flickered, exuding a terrifying aura. This was not the Yellow Spring mystery realm, where there would be restrictions in place to target power above the level of Sun Moon tier. Ling Han clenched his fist and shot out a punch. What? Are you planning to seek death? Yu Si was internally surprised. A mere mountain river tier would actually dare oppose a Sun Moon tier. Where had he gotten such outlandish courage from? He gave a humph, yet still drew back some of his power to avoid killing Ling Han with a single blow. As long as his crime was not proved and he himself sentenced, Ling Han would be a seed of the majestic heaven sect. Yu Si could only invite him back for the trial. If he crippled Ling Han or even killed him, then he would have to pay a corresponding price for his actions. A fist landed on the giant descending palm, and suddenly a frightening shock wave was generated. Pung, 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 pung. The mountain rocks around them were all shattered by the force. An expression of disbelief appeared on Yu Si's face. Ling Han's punch actually blocked his attack. This. The peak stage of the pinnacle level. You have actually cultivated to the peak stage of the pinnacle level. His astonishment was indescribable. The pinnacle level belonged to the territory of king tiers, but even so, it was not every king tier that could cultivate to the peak of the pinnacle level. This was the pinnacle level, and in this cultivation level, every step forward was incredibly difficult to take. Just how old was Ling Han? Yet he had already cultivated to the peak stage of the pinnacle level. Furthermore, the peak stage of the pinnacle level meant that his power could surpass a major tier. Presently, this brat's power was equivalent to that of the early stage of the low extreme of the Sun-Moon tier. Yu Si was actually in the late stage of the low extreme. Yet because he had feared killing Ling Han with a single strike, he had held back some of his power, causing the power on both sides to actually be more or less equal. Haha, no big deal. You do not have to admire me so much, Ling Han said, smiling. Humph, even if you are in the peak stage of the pinnacle level, so what? That is only equivalent to the early stage of the low extreme. I will still be able to easily suppress you. Yu Si said, that was good too. He could use his full abilities and needed not worry that he would mistakenly kill Ling Han, implicating himself as well. He used the power of the Sun-Moon tier, and all the divine patterns on his body lit up, exhibiting his full battle prowess. Brat, today I will let you know that the difference between Mountain River tier and Sun-Moon tier is not merely in terms of power, but also the grasp we have of the Tao of heaven and earth. He, too, delivered a punch. The divine patterns interwove densely together, forming a terrifying might. Ling Han took it head-on, yet was immediately sent flying, blood gushing from all over his body. He got back up with gritted teeth. The other had spoken true. The Sun-Moon tier was not only stronger than Mountain River tier in terms of power, but also in the level of comprehension of the regulations of this heaven and earth. He had cultivated to the peak stage of the pinnacle level, and in theory was only inferior to his opponent by 2 stars of power, but added with the regulations of heaven and earth. This gap was extraordinarily wide. Why was it said that 10 stars of power would be able to match the early stage of the low extreme of Sun-Moon tier? That was because this kind of Sun-Moon tier had just crossed over into this new territory, and their comprehension of the regulations was more or less equivalent to the peak stage of the pinnacle level. Come with me back to the sect obediently to undergo the trial. Yu Si moved again. He opened his mouth and spat out a giant brown bird. The bird spread its wings and flew towards Ling Han. This was a giant beast. When its wings stretched out, they were 300 meters long, and it was completely covered with divine patterns. This was completely an attack that was formed from the regulations of heaven and earth. Ling Han did not take the attack forcefully. He had already tried, and the other's battle prowess was indeed superior to his. If he took it head-on, he would only be seeking his own suffering. He began to roam around in battle by using the star plucking step. Though it no longer enabled him to have super speed, he could move in an erratic manner, which did not allow Yu Si to lock on him. Thus, his attack could not possibly exhibit the might that it should have had. Yu Si, however, was not impatient. Zhu Tianqiu should be able to arrive soon. The latter was in the peak stage of the low extreme. He would be able to take Ling Han down single-handedly. What more when joining forces with himself? He would only have to detain Ling Han and not allow the latter to go to the auction grounds. He was sure that Ling Han could not possibly have handed over a treasure like the 1,000-source true fluid to the Mo clan establishment ahead of time. Who would be able to do so without worrying? True enough, in a short while, Zhu Tianqiu had arrived. His burst of speed was indeed not as fast as Ling Han's, but its merit was that he could use that kind of speed for a long time. Thus, he had arrived only slightly later than Ling Han. Ha ha ha, let us see, where else will you go? Zhu Tianqiu's face was slightly flushed. He, a powerful elite of the Sun-Moon tier, actually allowed a mountain river tier to get away from him. How humiliating! Ling Han chuckled and said, "All right, I will follow you two back to the sect." Zhu Tianqiu and Yu Si suddenly felt uncomfortable, just like they had just thrown a punch into empty air. At first, they had wanted to properly create some difficulties for Ling Han, but who would have thought Ling Han would have been so decisive? However, since Ling Han had not been able to enter the town, he naturally couldn't have handed the 1,000-source true fluid over to the Mo clan establishment, and they could be considered to have successfully completed their mission. "Let's go then," the two said, their expressions dark. Ling Han did not look the slightest bit frustrated, causing Yu Si and his companion much confusion. Ling Han's plans had obviously failed, so why was he still so calm? They couldn't see through him. The trio headed towards the main peak. One elite of the Sun-Moon tier was walking in front and the other walking behind, with Ling Han sandwiched between them. They had condensed their origin power, but did not take any action. They would be able to burst out with the strongest blow at any moment to prevent Ling Han from running away. Yet Ling Han had completely no plans to flee. He smilingly asked, "Are you guys wondering why am I still so calm and serene now that I have completely failed and obviously not handed over the 1,000-source true fluid to the Mo clan establishment?" Both Yu Si and Zhu Tianqiu were internally baffled. This was indeed the source of their confusion. Yet these words had come so calmly and leisurely from Ling Han's mouth, giving them a very bizarre feeling. Humph! Since you know that you have completely failed, you should obediently hand over the 1,000-source true fluid. You have to know you are completely incapable of protecting so much divine fluid with your abilities, Yu Si declared coldly. Ling Han smiled slightly and said, "Haha, I know that you have placed my friends and disciple under surveillance. However, in truth, I am merely bait. Now that I have appeared, you would all come to chase after me. Haha, the disciple of mine should have already handed over the goods to the Mo clan establishment by now." Chapter 1206, Speaking Without Bounds. Chapter 1206, Speaking Without Bounds. What? Zhu Tianqiu and Yu Si almost jumped up in astonishment. Ling Han was only bait. Why were they targeting and chasing Ling Han? Although he had offended and disobeyed Gao Huang, this wasn't enough reason for the Gao faction to spend so much effort targeting him. The most important reason was the 4 drops of 1,000-source true fluid. However, he had actually handed these to the Mo clan establishment to auction. That being the case, what did it matter whether they captured Ling Han or not? They had been screwed over. "You look like you've eaten dead children," Ling Han said with a chuckle. "You have to understand that the 1,000-source true fluid was mine to begin with. Yet you people are so worried about it now. Heh, should I thank you guys?" His voice was full of ridicule. He had handed the 1,000-source true fluid and other auction items to Ding Ping before he went into seclusion. Moreover, he had correctly guessed that the Gao faction would monitor the people close to him. Thus, he had used himself as bait to draw all of them over. It was only natural that they fell for his trick. Ling Han, their main target, had appeared, so shouldn't they pursue him? "You must be lying," Zhu Tianqiu roared. He had already been screwed over by Ling Han once. If he was screwed over again, he wouldn't be able to raise his head anymore. It would be far too humiliating. "That's right. You're definitely trying to scare us into hurrying back, Yu Si said. That way, you'll be able to escape. Ling Han shrugged his shoulders and said, Ha! Only losers will stubbornly believe that they haven't lost yet. All right, it's time to leave. It's about time that this farce came to an end. I don't want to carry a non-existent accusation, even if it's only a suspicion. Zhu Tianqiu and Yu Si exchanged a glance. It was already too late to return to the Mo clan establishment. Their only option was to capture Ling Han and bring him back. That way, they would have at least accomplished their task. After a short while, they arrived at the White Jade Palace, which was located on the main peak. This palace was cut from flawless white jade. This was where the sect interrogated people and determined their innocence or guilt. After learning of Ling Han's return, several elites instantly hurried over. They would act as judges. There were 5 elites in total, and they were all at the peak stage of the Sun-Moon tier. Heavenly Body tier elites naturally wouldn't come to interrogate a measly Mountain River tier cultivator, after all, who had so much spare time. If this was the case for Heavenly Body tier elites, then it was obviously more so the case for Eternal River tier elites. Venerable Trinity spent almost all of his time cultivating. He barely ever came out of seclusion. However, were elites at the peak stage of the Sun-Moon tier not enough? Apart from the 1 Eternal River tier elite and 24 Heavenly Body tier elites, this was the most powerful force of the majestic Heaven sect. This was a force to be reckoned with, even when casting one's eyes over the entire galaxy. Han Ling, are you not going to kneel before us? One of the judges roared. He was called Shen Kuo, and he was the head of the 5 judges. Thus, he was naturally seated in the middle. Ling Han smiled calmly and said, This disciple hasn't broken any sect rules, so what am I being accused of? Moreover, I'm a seed, so I don't have to kneel before you, am I correct? My respects to you, seniors. He clasped his hands in front of him and nodded at the 5 judges. This was his respectful greeting. What an arrogant brat! Another Judge Ma Ge exclaimed. His eyes were very narrow, and there was a strangely feminine feel about him. Youth that which is too hard snaps easily. Those who are too arrogant never meet with good fate. Oh, are you talking about Yang Hao? Ling Han chuckled and said, He's indeed very arrogant. He's already at the Sun-Moon tier, yet he's still targeting cultivators at the Mountain River tier. He's ignoring the rules of the sect, yet he actually went unpunished even after causing such a great commotion. There's truly no justice. Pooh! The 5 judges almost exploded in rage. You're pretty fucking good at spewing sh*t, aren't you? Yang Hao was indeed very arrogant. However, he was a 1 in 1,000,000 years prodigy. In fact, there was even a chance that Venerable Trinity would choose him as a successor. Thus, he had the right to be arrogant. Moreover, hadn't Yang Hao been severely beaten by the Empress already? Even his life essence had started to drain, and his lifespan had decreased by at least several hundred years. Visit on our novelful. Although a few hundred years wasn't significant to Heavenly Body tier elites, it wasn't insignificant either. When they neared the end of their lifespan, even a period of a few hours would be extremely precious, let alone a period of several hundred years. Yang Hao hadn't caused a fuss after suffering this fate, yet Ling Han was standing here and taking jabs? Where was the justice? Shen Kuo coughed loudly and said, Han Lin, stop trying to deride others. The aim of this trial was to determine whether Ling Han was innocent or guilty. So, what reason was there to talk about others? His expression became cold, and he asked, Do you understand your crime? Understand what crime? Ling Han retorted with a smile. During your time in the Yellow Spring Mystery Realm, you slaughtered the Gao faction's Shiming as well as his companions. Not only that, but you even stole their 1,000-source true fluid. Shen Kuo's voice was frosty, and he even unleashed his Sun-Moon tier aura toward Ling Han. Unfortunately for him, Ling Han's divine sense was extremely sturdy and tough thanks to the tempering from the indestructible Heaven Scroll. Moreover, he had even refined a remnant wisp of demonic power source. Thus, if one wanted to suppress his divine sense, they would need to be at least Genesis tier elites. As for Sun Moon tier elites, they weren't powerful enough. Ling Han stood proudly and said, "What Gao faction? I've never seen it before. In fact, I've never even heard of it. Utter drivel." Ma Gai humphed and said, "If you don't have a guilty conscience, why did you disappear for several months and make it impossible for others to find you? You truly like to joke. Isn't it extremely normal for cultivators to cultivate in seclusion?" Ling Han smiled and continued, "Perhaps you make a special report to the sect before you go into seclusion." Ma Gai was instantly rendered speechless. Of course disciples could go into seclusion as they pleased. However, the timing of Ling Han's seclusion was far too coincidental to be an accident. No matter how one looked at it, it was clearly the action of a criminal escaping prosecution. Shen Kuo waved his hand and said, "This is a fair and just trial to determine whether you're guilty or innocent. So, we still haven't used any instruments of torture on you yet. The sect definitely won't torture you into making a false admission. However, we won't allow criminals to lie their way out, either." "Senior is so just!" Ling Han exclaimed with a smile. However, there was strong flavor of sarcasm in his voice. Shen Kuo really wanted to slap him to death. However, he could only suppress his urge upon thinking of Ling Han's identity as a seed. Anyhow, were it not for the fact that Ling Han had come from a small world and didn't have any background, how would they dare to target a seed? Which seed didn't have the support of heavenly body tier elites? The situation surrounding Ling Han, the Rain Emperor, and Ding Ping was extremely unique. 3 seed-level geniuses had actually come from the same small world. Shen Kuo composed himself and said, "You're innocent for the time being. However, there's still a dispute regarding which party the 1,000-source true fluid belongs to. So, I'll have to ask you to hand over the 1,000-source true fluid first. If it truly belongs to you, we'll naturally return it later." After saying so much, their true aim was still the 1,000-source true fluid. This was to be expected. If it were Ling Han alone, the Gao faction definitely wouldn't spend so much effort and resources. Ling Han laughed loudly and said, "Senior, are you trying to say that the 1,000-source true fluid was obtained by that crap faction or whatever? Heh, you're quite the joker. How could those weaklings have obtained the 1,000-source true fluid? For drops, no less." "Oh, that's right. I heard that Yang Hao also obtained 2 drops before. If that crap faction obtained 4 drops, doesn't that mean that they're even more powerful than Yang Hao? Weaklings." Shen Kuo and the other judges all winced upon hearing this. In reality, they were all members of the Gao faction. Although Ling Han hadn't called any names, he had effectively called all of them weaklings in his sweeping statement. He was a measly mountain river tier cultivator, yet he had pointed at their noses and called them weaklings? How could they accept this? What a toxic brat. Chapter 1207. Mastermind finally appears. Chapter 1207. Mastermind finally appears. Ling Han spread his hands with a smile and said, "To be honest with you, I've already handed the 1,000-source true fluid to the MO clan establishment to auction. So, you can all stop thinking about it now. If you don't believe me, you can go out and ask around. Based on my understanding of you people, I trust that you already have people at the auction. In fact, it's about time that they report back. Go on, keep interrogating me. Although the innocent will remain innocent no matter what, there's always those who try to pour dirty water on others. I'm also extremely pissed off." Shen Kuo, Ma Gai, and the other judges all wore dark expressions. Did this brat really think that he was here as a guest? He was far too calm and composed. However, if what he said had been true, then they would really have been screwed over. They looked toward Zhu Tianqiu, and you see, cold sweat instantly dripped down the two men's foreheads. If young master failed to obtain the 4 drops of thousand-source true fluid, they would definitely have to shoulder a significant portion of the blame. The faces became as white as a sheet when they thought of Gao Huang's torture methods. It was as if they had become extremely sick. Han Lin, what gall you have? Shen Ku roared in anger. The ownership of the thousand-source true fluid is still under dispute. Yet you actually put it up for auction. Are you blatantly opposing the sect? Ling Han smiled and said, "Stop spewing such utter nonsense. The 4 drops of thousand-source true fluid are mine no matter how you want to paint the situation. If you don't believe me, you can ask all of the mountain river tier cultivators in the sect to attack me. That way, you'll see whether or not I'm able to defeat all of them by myself, no. Anyhow, your accusations are completely baseless. In fact, let's talk about Sherming and the others. Since you've accused me of killing them, where are your witnesses and physical evidence? They couldn't have told you in your dreams, right?" Pooh! A few ordinary disciples who were maintaining the order outside the palace instantly spluttered with laughter. However, this wasn't the public trial, so there was no one standing around and watching. Thus, these disciples barely had anything to do. Shen Kuo's expression became extremely dark. He had never dreamed that a day would come when he would almost explode in anger due to the words of a mountain river tier cultivator. After all, it was almost impossible for such a situation to occur. Which mountain river tier cultivator dared to speak back to Sun Moon tier elites? Moreover, would it matter if they spoke back? If they did, the Sun Moon tier elites could simply smack them to death. What could the mountain river tier cultivators do about this? However, he truly couldn't smack Ling Han to death at this moment. First of all, he couldn't confirm whether the thousand-source true fluid had truly been handed to the Mo clan establishment to auction. If he smacked Ling Han to death, and it turned out that he was hiding it somewhere, he could sit tight and wait for Gao Huang to kill him. Second of all, Ling Han was still a seed. As long as he retained the status, it would be beyond his authority to kill him. Thus, Shen Kuo could only suppress his anger. Pung! The door of the White Jade Palace was suddenly pushed open at this moment. In fact, it was probably kicked open. The person at the door was still in a kicking posture. This was a slender youth who appeared extremely handsome. However, a terrifying aura radiated from his body, and the pressure that it exuded caused many of the people present to have difficulty breathing. It was as if they were being choked. "Our respects to young master." Shin Kuo and the others immediately stood up and bowed respectfully to the youth. Meanwhile, the mountain river tier disciples instantly kneeled down in greeting. This person was Gao Huang. Ling Han turned around to look at this opponent he had never seen before. He needed to remember this person's appearance, lest he accidentally killed the wrong person in the future. Gao Huang wore an angry expression as he strode into the hall. He humphed coldly and said, "What are you trash even doing? I received a report that a drop of thousand-source true fluid has already been auctioned." The appearance of this drop meant that the remaining 3 drops were also in the hands of the Mo clan establishment. Shin Kuo and the others remained silent, just like cicadas in the cold. Although they were Sun Moon tier elites, they were like little children before Gao Huang. There was nothing they could do about this. Gao Huang wasn't weaker than them, and his status was far above theirs. Moreover, his father was an elite at the peak stage of the heavenly body tier. Who would dare to provoke him? In any case, they were all members of the Gao faction, so how would they dare to disrespect their young master? Gao Huang turned his gaze to Ling Han and said, "You immediately head to the auction house and stop the auction." "Oh, why should I?" Ling Han asked with a smile. "Because I command you to do so," Gao Huang said haughtily. "Dumb C***NT. Ling Han snorted. Why you dare to scold me?" Gao Huang shouted in fury. Ling Han shrugged his shoulders and said, "If you're not a dumb C***NT, why did assume I was talking about you? If you are a dumb C***NT, then I'm merely telling the truth. If telling the truth is equivalent to scolding, then I've really got nothing to say." Gao Huang instantly exploded in rage. He had never seen someone curse another person so righteously before. He humphed and said, "You're acting so arrogant even though you're in an interrogation hall. What a rare sight. However, don't forget where this is." What are you all standing there for? Continue the interrogation." Shen Kuo and the others all looked at each other. Hadn't they been interrogating Ling Han before? It was the sudden arrival of Gao Huang that had interrupted the trial. Yet, Gao Huang was actually blaming them. However, did they dare to grumble in complaint? They weren't Ling Han, nor were they as courageous as him. "Han Lin, no matter how many excuses you come up with, you won't be able to escape the chains of justice." Shen Kuo returned to his seat before slamming the table and saying, "Invite the witnesses." It wasn't long before several people walked out from the back of the hall. They were all youthful disciples at the Mountain River Tier. "Did you witness Han Lin killing Sherming and the others?" Shen Kuo asked. "We did, Senior," the Mountain River Tier disciples said, nodding respectfully. Shen Kuo turned to Ling Han and asked, "Han Lin, do you have anything to say?" Ling Han laughed loudly, then pointed at one of the youths and said, "Let me ask you, what technique and weapon did I use to kill Sherming?" The youth was rendered speechless. They hadn't prepared an answer to this. "What? You witnessed me killing them, yet you have no idea how I killed them?" Ling Han smiled and said, "Is there something wrong with your eyes?" "Hold it. Don't answer my question yet." Ling Han waved his hand at the youth, then turned to the other disciples and said, "Since you all witnessed me killing Sherming, tell me together, what weapon did I use to kill him?" "There's no need to hurry. I'll count to 3, and you can all answer together. 1, 2. Enough!" Shen Kuo roared. "Han Lin, how long are you going to muck around for?" Ling Han was astonished, and he said, "Am I not proving my own innocence? Anyhow, this is a very simple question, is it not? Since they witnessed me killing them, isn't it well within my rights to ask them what technique and weapon I used?" "Humph! You're threatening the witnesses," Shen Kuo said sharply. How would I dare to threaten the witnesses before Sun Moon Tier judges? I don't have the power to do that even if I wanted to." Ling Han's voice was calm, and he continued, "Then I may as well remain silent. Will that satisfy you, seniors?" What an argumentative person. There was a long laugh, and a person appeared before the door of the palace. No, there were 2 people, one in front and one behind. The person standing in front was a handsome youth, was no less handsome than Gao Huang. Moreover, his strength was likely no weaker, either. The aura that radiated from him was also suffocating. Ling Han didn't recognize this person. However, he immediately guessed his identity upon seeing that the person behind him was Ji Yunji. He was Hua Yongwen, the young master of the Hua faction. Chapter 1208, A Gathering of Villains. Chapter 1208, A Gathering of Villains. "Hua Yongwen, why are you here?" Gao Huang asked with a humph. This isn't your house, so why can't I be here?" Hua Yongwen was naturally unafraid of Gao Huang. They were both descendants of disciples of an eternal River Tier elite, and they were both the young master of their respective faction. Their status was identical, their cultivation level was identical, and their strength was also identical. Gao Huang stared at Hua Yongwen. He had already lost the 1,000-source true fluid, so he was naturally beside himself with fury. Right now, he wanted to take his anger out on Ling Han. Thus, the worst thing that could happen was if someone stepped out to protect Ling Han. Hua Yongwen pointed at Ling Han and said, "Don't worry, I didn't come to protect him." Killing intent flashed across his eyes. Gao Huang instantly came to a realization. The Hua faction had evidently made a deal with Ling Han before, and it was because of this deal that they had helped him. The 1,000-source true fluid had most likely been an integral part of this deal. Otherwise, why would Hua Yongwen have been so fervent? However, after a while, the Hua faction had suddenly stopped helping him. This was undoubtedly because their deal had fallen through. In other words, the Hua faction had given up on Ling Han. Thinking carefully, the Hua faction hadn't prevented them from listing Ling Han on the interrogation list. In fact, they had even encouraged this. From this, it could be seen that the Hua faction also wanted to capture Ling Han. It was just that they were hiding in the background and out of sight. In order to interrogate a seed, they needed support from over half of the 24 heavenly body tier elites. Thus, if the Hua faction wanted to protect Ling Han, they could have easily prevented him from entering the White Jade Palace. Of course, they would definitely have to pay a price for this. Anyhow, everyone had wanted to snatch the 1,000-source true fluid from Ling Han's hands. It was just that the Gao faction had been the most active and fervent. If the Gao faction had succeeded in obtaining the 4 drops of 1,000-source true fluid, the Hua faction, and other factions definitely wouldn't have sat on their hands. They would have all stepped in to take a slice of the cake. This was inevitable. After all, Ling Han was a soft target. Brilliant. It's fine as long as he's not here to protect Ling Han. Gao Huang nodded and said, "We already have all the witnesses and evidence, so hurry up and deliver the judgment. Strip him of his identity as a seed." Hua Yongwen wore a faint smile as he watched on. This measly mountain river tier cultivator had actually dared to reject him. How foolish! He had especially come here to witness Ling Han's suffering. He wanted to see his expression of anger and remorse. Ling Han looked at them coldly. This was a gathering of rats and snakes one, so it would be useless no matter how he explained himself. All he could do was speak a few words of ridicule. However, nothing he did would change the end result. Of course, this was unless a powerful elite stepped in to help him. However, such a possibility was incredibly slim. Ahem. There was an awkward expression on Shen Kuo's face. He was the main judge, yet he was being commanded like a dog by Gao Huang. He forced a serious expression onto his face and said, "Han Lin, there's irrefutable evidence that you killed your fellow disciples. I hereby announce that, from this moment on, you're stripped of your identity as a seed and stripped of your identity as a disciple of the majestic heaven sect." Pah! He slammed the table heavily. "You committed the abhorrent crime of killing fellow disciples, according to the rules of the sect." Ha 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 ha. Shen Kuo was just about to announce further punishment, yet Gao Huang had already started to laugh loudly. Gao Huang's laughter cut him off, and he could only shut his mouth awkwardly. "Han Lin, do you regret your decisions now?" Gao Huang's voice was cold, and he continued, "You're a measly mountain river tier cultivator, and you're more so a bumpkin from a small world. Yet you actually dared to oppose me? Are you worthy? Do you have the right? I'm going to give you one final chance. Kneel down and beg me for forgiveness. Perhaps I'll be lenient and spare your life." Ling Han shook his head and said, "Gao Huang, you truly haven't disappointed me. You really are a cold and heartless person. Didn't you say that I killed Sherming? Yet you'll actually spare me if I kneel down and kowtow to you. Aren't you afraid of alienating your subordinates?" Sure enough, the expressions of Shen Kuo and the others changed when they heard this. Gao Huang paid no heed to this. In his mind, apart from his father, other people were all lackeys and dogs that acted on his command. If they were disobedient, he would simply kill them. The most abundant resource in this world was lackeys. So why did he need to care? He laughed loudly and said, "This is your only way to avoid death. Become my dog and I'll spare your life." Keep dreaming. Ling Han shook his head and said, "The only person who'll be kneeling and kowtowing is you." Preposterous. Gao Huang seethed. He truly didn't understand where Ling Han was getting his confidence from. He had already lost his identity as a seed, and he was a mere lamb for slaughter. Ling Han swept his gaze over Gao Huang and Hua Yongwen, and then said, "I've already remembered your appearances. It's best that you remember what happened today. I'll return within 10 years to repay this debt." He had already decided to enter the Black Tower and leave the majestic heaven sect. After 10 years, he could perhaps become a heavenly body tier elite. At that time, he would return to exact revenge. He wasn't overly worried about Ding Ping, Shui Yinyu, and the others. After all, they were all disciples of the majestic heaven sect. Even if Gao Huang wanted to target them, he would need to frame them first, just as he had done with Ling Han. However, timing and opportunities were integral when trying to frame someone. Ling Han wouldn't give them this chance. He had already discussed this with Shui Yinyu and the others, and they had all gathered at the Mo clan establishment today. If things went awry, they would immediately leave together. He was only one step away from reaching the Sun Moon tier, so it was about time that he went to search for the Rock Palace, the Heavenly Phoenix Divine Maiden, and the others. This was a decent opportunity to leave. Moreover, he had already asked the Mo clan establishment to help him search for the Rock Palace and the 5 sects. Once there was information, he would immediately set off. "Ha! You're still as arrogant as ever." Another voice traveled over, and a deity-like man walked into the palace. A long shadow was cast by his tall figure, and it was as if people could only kowtow under his shadows. It was Yang Hao. "Oh, our respects to Uncle Yang." Gao Huang and Hua Yongwen exchanged a glance before greeting Yang Hao respectfully. "What, Uncle Yang?" One had to realize that Gao Huang and Yang Hao were both at the peak stage of the Sun Moon tier. Meanwhile, Yang Hao was only the high extreme of the Sun Moon tier. So, why were they referring to him as a senior? Unless Uncle Yang officially became the 10th disciple of the Grandmaster yesterday. Gao Huang explained. He was someone who cared about face, so he naturally explained why he had referred to Yang Hao as Uncle Yang. Now that he had become the 10th disciple of the Venerable Trinity, Yang Hao's status had changed completely. Even though his cultivation level was still low, even heavenly body tier elites would have to treat him with the utmost respect. One could disrespect Yang Hao, but could they disrespect Venerable Trinity? If one held themselves in higher regard than Yang Hao, wouldn't they be claiming to be on the same level as Venerable Trinity? Who in this galaxy had the right to claim this? Everyone was stunned by this sudden turn of events, although there had been rumors floating around. Who could read the mind of an Eternal River tier elite? Now that Yang Hao's status had been confirmed, everyone was naturally stunned. Sure enough, Yang Hao had become the 10th disciple of Venerable Trinity. Yang Hao's status rose so dramatically that he was on equal standing with heavenly body tier elites. A faint smile appeared on Yang Hao's face as he looked at Ling Han. However, there was terrifying killing intent hidden in the depths of his eyes. Chapter 1209, Give me a retrial. Chapter 1209, Give me a retrial. Yang Hao had always been a successful genius. He'd been born into a force with a heaven body tier elite, and he had displayed an outstanding cultivation talent from a young age. He had always been as brilliant as the radiant sun in the sky, and people all revered his prodigiousness no matter where he went. His family had extremely high hopes of him. Moreover, he was an invincible prodigy among those of the same generation as him. Everyone respected and feared him. In fact, he had managed to defeat all prodigies that stood in his way even after arriving at the majestic heaven sect. He was the true cream of the crop. He was blessed by the heavens, and he was destined to become a ruler of a region. However, he had suffered great humiliation at the hands of Ling Han. Although it wasn't Ling Han who had defeated him, the fact remained that he had almost been beaten to death by Empress Luanxing. In the end, he had lost a significant amount of his life essence. This was a great stain on his name, and he would definitely exact revenge on Empress Lanxing in the future. Right now, however, he would kill Ling Han first that would collect some interest. Han Lin, killing fellow disciples, is a serious crime. Not only that, but it's also a despicable action. His voice was cold, and he continued, I suggest that we tie him up in front of the sect entrance and slice a piece of his flesh off every day. We'll continue until he bleeds out and his life essence withers. So ruthless, everyone exclaimed in their minds. It was extremely difficult for immortals to die. As long as their vitals weren't obliterated, they could live on even if their limbs were severed or their blood was drained. After all, severed limbs could regrow, and blood could also be regenerated. However, these recovery methods all consumed one's life essence. Life essence couldn't be seen or touched, yet it did indeed exist. In fact, there were sinister techniques that could suck one's life essence and transform it into nourishment for the wielder of the sinister technique. Doing so would increase the wielder's lifespan by a slight amount as well as aid the growth of their cultivation. It was clear that Yang Hao wanted Ling Han to experience a slow and excruciating death. He would only die when his life essence completely ran out. This was incredibly cruel. Gao Huang and Hua Yongwen were both secretly alarmed. This young man was an extremely ruthless individual. They definitely couldn't offend him. Ling Han laughed loudly and said, Yang Hao, how pathetic of you! Come. Suppress your cultivation level and fight against me. See how I wipe the floor with you. Yang Hao sneered and said, Who do you think you are? Do you have the right to fight against me? Don't say that I'm bullying you. If we were at the same cultivation level, I could give myself a handicap of 1 hand and 1 foot. Ling Han placed his left hand behind his back, then cracked a grin, and said, Actually, I can also handicap my right hand if you want. He placed his right hand behind his back. Arrogant, how extremely arrogant. Uncle Yang, why don't we restrain him first? We can give him some heavy punishment to make him more obedient, Gao Huang suggested. Although he was much older than Yang Hao, and although his cultivation level was also slightly higher, he still placed himself in an extremely lowly position. It was fairly hard for such a proud person to act so subserviently. Yang Hao nodded and said, Great idea. Restrain him. He gazed at Ling Han. How could such a measly being challenge him? Absolutely preposterous. Ling Han's heart shivered. They were finally going to bare their fangs. Once they did, it would also be time for him to enter the Black Tower. He would exact his revenge another day. Humph. It looks like you still haven't learned your lesson yet. You're still biting people like a mad dog. There was a cold humph as Hu Feiyun walked over. However, the aura that radiated from her was far above the mountain river tier. It was Empress Lanxing. Ling Han's brows knit into a frown. He had already planned his escape. However, the actions of Empress Lanxing could potentially derail his plans. After all, how could he have stayed in his Black Tower if Empress Lanxing was caught in a dangerous situation? She had stepped in to help him, so how could he sit by idly? This was not to mention the budding relationship between him and Empress Lanxing. Yang Hao had never been afraid of anyone before. However, fear appeared on his face when he saw Empress Lanxing. He had been beaten senseless by her, so it was hard not to fear her. Pah! The Empress lashed out with her palm, and Yang Hao was instantly sent flying. Pooh! Clouds of blood exploded from Yang Hao's body, and his life essence instantly started to wither. He had been severely wounded. Fortunately, the Empress had held back. Otherwise, how could Yang Hao have survived the attack of a heavenly body tier elite? Madam, this is already the 2nd time, an icy voice said. This was the majestic heaven sect. 2 figures materialized in the air. They both looked to be 50, and an air of primal chaos shrouded their faces, making it impossible to see their features clearly, for heavenly bodies hovered behind their bodies. Father, Gao Huang and Hua Yongwen were delighted to see these two figures. They were the fourth and sixth disciples of Venerable Trinity Gaofeng, the leader of the Gao faction, and Hua Yongning, the leader of the Hua faction. They were both elites at the peak stage of the consummate level of the heavenly body tier. Madam, you've gone too far, Hua Yongning said coldly. This is the majestic heaven sect, not your chaotic star's majestic empire. You too want to obstruct me. Empress Luanxing asked calmly. However, there was a domineering air about her voice. In terms of aura, who could compare with a ruler? Moreover, Hua Yongning and Gao Feng weren't even sect leaders. Although their cultivation levels were the same, the might of Empress Luanxing was far above there. However, Ling Han interrupted. Your Majesty, this is my private matter. Please don't interfere. He frantically winked at her as he said this. You already know that I have a spatial god tool. So, who can harm your man? Empress Luanxing saw this. Yet she said, he's my subject, and I heard that you people wanted to interrogate him. So, I merely came here to look on. Look on your mom. Would looking on cause blood to explode from Yang Hao's body? Would it cause his life essence to wither even further? However, there was genuinely nothing they could do if a heavenly body tier elite insisted on twisting the facts unless they fought. There was a look of apprehension on Hua Yongning's and Gao Feng's face. They were up against an empress, and they definitely couldn't underestimate her. However, they were only apprehensive. After all, they believed that this was merely a spiritual mark left by Empress Luanxing. As such, there would be a limit to her power. Fine. We'll let you look on if that's what you so desire. Hua Yongning and Gao Feng both stood with their hands clasped behind their backs. With them keeping watch, there was no way that Empress Luanxing could cause any great trouble. Yang Hao slowly crawled up from the floor, his eyes burning with anger. Motherfucker, what about me? Was I hit for nothing? Aren't you going to begin the trial? Empress Luanxing asked as she looked at Xinhua. Her aura was devastating, and images of celestial bodies and galaxies flashed through her eyes. Her might was so formidable that Xinhua almost spat blood. He couldn't help but grimace. Begin what fucking trial? Haven't we already stripped him of his status as a seed and expelled him from the sect? He hesitated for a moment before re-announcing the decision of the judges. Pah! He was immediately struck and sent flying by Empress Luanxing upon finishing his sentence. He felt as if all of his bones had been broken, and he realized that he couldn't crawl up from the floor. I disagree with this decision. Redo the trial, Empress Luanxing said in a domineering manner. Madam, you've gone too far. Hua Yongning and Gao Feng finally reached their limit. Did she really think that this was the chaotic star's majestic empire? Ha! Young lady, I let the matter slide when you caused a commotion in my sect the first time. However, you've come to cause trouble again. The person you struck just then is my disciple. A terrifying voice traveled over, causing everyone to shiver to the depths of their soul. This was the overwhelming pressure from a transcendent being. Venerable Trinity had come. Chapter 1210, Venerable Trinity. Chapter 1210, Venerable Trinity. Who could have imagined that the trial of a measly mountain river tier cultivator would eventually lead to the appearance of an eternal river tier elite? Empress Luanxing's expression changed drastically. She was powerful, yet she still had yet to reach the pinnacle level of the heavenly body tier. So, how could she stand up against an eternal river tier elite? However, she refused to back down, saying, Senior, heaven and earth are great, but nothing is as great as justice. This nest of rats is cooking up charges and trying to frame the innocent. I can't watch on and do nothing. Ha! young lady, the matters of the majestic heaven sect don't need your input." Venerable Trinity's voice traveled over, yet he was nowhere to be seen. "Just answer my question. Why did you wound my disciple?" Yang Hao chuckled coldly. Venerable Trinity had bestowed him with a divine sense seal, and this meant that he could contact Venerable Trinity simply by injecting his divine sense into the seal. Reporting matters like this couldn't be any easier. Moreover, this revealed just how much Venerable Trinity liked this new disciple. So what if Empress Luanxing was a heavenly body tier elite? She was nothing but trash before an eternal river tier elite. Yet she had actually dared to hit him, not once but twice. Humph! It was time for her to pay the price. Empress Luanxing raised her brow and said, "Senior wants to pick on the weak." "Little girl, don't try to constrain me with words." Venerable Trinity said, "I can let you off one more time if you kneel down and apologize to my disciple." This was complete and utter humiliation. To say nothing of a ruler like Empress Luanxing, even ordinary heavenly body tier elites couldn't swallow their pride to kneel down and kowtow to a sun-moon tier cultivator. Empress Luanxing's expression changed drastically. She hadn't expected Venerable Trinity to be so protective of his disciples. Could they still reason objectively? However, reason was always held in the hands of elites. Weaklings could only resign themselves to accepting this. Ha! 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 Empress Luanxing laughed coldly. Out of her 9 clones, only one had yet to reach the heavenly body tier. However, with her wealth of experience and her abundance of resources, Hu Feiyun only needed a maximum of 100 years to reach the heavenly body tier. Once Hu Feiyun reached the heavenly body tier, she would be able to advance to the pinnacle level of the heavenly body tier. She would then be able to break through to the eternal river tier. King tiers who cultivated each level to perfection would possess a power of 6 stars once they advanced to the next major tier. This would be enough to battle against Venerable Trinity. Based on all the available intelligence, Venerable Trinity was most likely at the late stage of the low extreme of the eternal river tier. However, Empress Luanxing was still too weak at this moment, far too weak. "Young lady, it looks like you're unwilling to yield." Venerable Trinity chuckled and said, "However, that won't change anything. However, she hit you, so why don't you hit her back?" "But, Master, she's at the heavenly body tier. I'm no match for her," Yang Hao replied respectfully. "Heh, isn't your master here for you?" Venerable Trinity said, "Thank you, Master." A cold smile instantly appeared on Yang Hao's face. Venerable Trinity had already made his stance very clear, was allowing him to return the favor. With Venerable Trinity protecting him, how could a measly heavenly body tier elite fight back? No matter how freakish a heavenly body tier elite was, they were still like defenseless babies in the eyes of eternal river tier elites. Ling Han's expression became very anxious. It would be extremely humiliating if Empress Luanxing were hit, even if this was only her clone. Empress Luanxing wouldn't be able to tolerate this, and he more so wouldn't be able to tolerate this. "Come here," he shouted. So what if Venerable Trinity was present? He was going to put Empress Luanxing in his black tower. She was his future wife, so how could he let her be humiliated? Empress Luanxing had initially planned on causing a commotion and making everyone aware of this injustice. She had wanted to win Ling Han a fair trial. However, she hadn't been able to control her emotions, and she had ended up hitting Yang Hao and causing Venerable Trinity to come. This made the situation even direr than before. However, she was a resolute person, and she immediately dashed toward Ling Han. Venerable Trinity laughed and said, "Ha! Trying to flee!" Empress Luanxing was instantly frozen in place. It was as if she had become a statue. Yang Hao snickered as he walked toward Empress Luanxing. He raised his hand and he was just about to slap her. He was going to exact his revenge so soon, and this filled him with pleasure. Of course, this was only a clone of Empress Lanxing. If he saw her true appearance, it was very likely that he wouldn't have the heart to slap her. However, being as proud as Empress Lanxing was, she naturally wouldn't use her appearance to garner sympathy. Schwa! Yang Hao's hand struck at Empress Lanxing's face. However, a shadow suddenly flashed over. Pa! There was a crisp smacking sound. Ling Han was sent flying by the strike. He had activated the star-plucking step and dashed in front of Yang Hao, blocking the strike for Empress Lanxing. However, even though his physique was powerful, there was still a limit to how much power it could withstand. Yang Hao was at the high extreme of the Sun-Moon tier, and his strike had broken several of Ling Han's godly bones. Wah! Ling Han vomited mouthfuls of blood. After enduring a full power strike of a Sun-Moon tier elite, black spots swam before his eyes. He was about to faint to even die at any moment. He had never been so close to death before. He forced himself to concentrate as he circulated a drop of indestructible, true fluid. His body instantly recovered. Venerable Trinity was astonished by Ling Han's tremendous recovery ability. Although Ling Han's lunging block had also been spectacular, that was simply because Venerable Trinity hadn't paid any attention to him. Otherwise, there was no way Ling Han could have blocked that strike. Meanwhile, Yang Hao's eyes also widened in surprise. He didn't die after being hit by my full power strike? So what? That strike was only a whisker away from killing him. He'll be a corpse if I hit again. There's no way he can endure another strike, right? Anyhow, he probably ingested some natural treasures before coming here. Otherwise, how could he have recovered instantly? He chuckled coldly before turning his gaze back to Empress Lanxing. She was being suppressed by Venerable Trinity, meaning that she was completely defenseless. There was no pleasure in slapping a mountain river tier cultivator. If he wanted to slap someone, he would slap heavenly body tier elites. These slaps would be loud, and these slaps would be euphoric. Moreover, the heavenly body tier elite before him had made him spit blood and lose life essence twice, had to exact revenge. He swung his hand at Empress Lanxing again. He knew that Ling Han would definitely lunge over and attempt to block him, but he didn't care at all. Toying with Ling Han felt absolutely amazing. Pum! Sure enough, Ling Han activated the star, plucking step, and blocked his strike again. Like before, he was sent flying into the distance. Clouds of blood burst from his body, and several of his godly bones snapped again. This strike was even more vicious, as Yang Hao had unleashed the regulations of heaven and earth in addition to his Sun-Moon tier power. Hundreds of divine patterns materialized in the air, intertwining to form a terrifying, killing intent. Ling Han was barely hanging on to life. Not being killed by that strike was already thanks to his freakishly tough physique. After all, even those at the high extreme of the Sun-Moon tier couldn't shatter level 5 godly metal with a single strike. All of you deserve to die! Empress Lanxing cried out sharply. There was astounding, killing intent in her eyes. A ruler was enraged, and heaven and earth lost their luster. Her body trembled slightly, and it seemed as if she were about to break free from Venerable Trinity's grasp. Young lady, you're far too naive. Venerable Trinity said with a chuckle. The pressure on Empress Lanxing increased explosively, and she was instantly rendered immobile again. Chapter 1211, I've returned. Chapter 1211, I've returned. Ling Han circulated another drop of indestructible true fluid, and his wounds instantly started to mend. However, circulating 2 drops of indestructible true fluid in quick succession caused its effects to decrease dramatically. The second drop of indestructible true fluid was only able to stabilize and mend his wounds. not completely heal them. Even so, his recovery ability was still absolutely stunning. Even Venerable Trinity's interest was piqued, and he remarked, "This youth is fairly outstanding." How high were Venerable Trinity's standards? Being praised as outstanding by him was truly remarkable. A feeling of jealousy welled up in Yang Hao's heart. He was afraid that Venerable Trinity would take a liking to Ling Han's talent and take him as a disciple. If that were to happen, he wouldn't be able to exact his revenge anymore. Moreover, he would have another powerful competitor. The thought of this made him especially uneasy. Sure enough, Venerable Trinity said, "Young man, are you willing to acknowledge me as master?" If he had asked this upon his arrival, perhaps Ling Han would have agreed. Even if his intentions weren't genuine, he could at least take advantage of his new identity to overcome this dire situation. However, Venerable Trinity had suppressed Empress Luanxing and allowed Yang Hao to strike her. Ling Han couldn't accept this. Venerable Trinity was targeting his future wife, yet he still wanted him to acknowledge him as master, and Yang Hao would become his senior brother. "No way," Ling Han chuckled and said, "Those who are teachers should be virtuous. Venerable Trinity, do you think you possess the virtue of a teacher?" The surroundings instantly fell silent. Is there something wrong with my ears? Why do I feel like I heard that brat criticizing Venerable Trinity? Gasp! How daring! Someone in this galaxy actually dares to question Venerable Trinity's virtue before his face. Is this a joke? Impudence! Hua Yongning and Gao Feng berated. They hadn't planned on unleashing their might at a measly mountain river tier cultivator. Yet, who told Ling Han to insult their master? They had no choice but to act. Meanwhile, Yang Hao breathed a sigh of relief. Having insulted Venerable Trinity, there was no way that Ling Han could be taken as his disciple anymore, regardless of how talented he was. He couldn't help but chuckle at Ling Han's stupidity in his mind. True men should know when to yield and when to stand firm. Standing firm when one didn't possess enough power was merely seeking death. He was afraid that Venerable Trinity would let him off the hook due to his appreciation of prodigies. Thus, he immediately charged toward Ling Han, shouting, "How dare you insult my master? You're asking for death." Divine patterns intertwined as his palm struck at Ling Han. He had put all of his power behind this strike. He was going to kill Ling Han and eliminate all future trouble. Whoa! Shadows of giant snakes materialized behind Empress Luanxing, each of them measuring tens of thousands of meters in length. They all exuded an ancient and desolate aura. Venerable Trinity's suppression instantly vanished, and she immediately pressed her palm toward Yang Hao. Damn it! Hua Yongning and Gao Feng hurriedly dashed over to block Empress Luanxing's attack. If Yang Hao were killed before them, they would definitely be punished severely. They wouldn't be killed, but they would certainly fall out of favor with Venerable Trinity. If that were to happen, it would be impossible for them to obtain his core inheritance. They couldn't accept such a fate. The two heavenly body tier elites lunged over to block Empress Luanxing's attack. Although they had reacted too late, their closer distance to Yang Hao meant that they were still able to block her attack. Boom! The strikes of the three elites collided together. Pung, 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 pung. Shock waves surged into the surroundings, instantly smashing the palace into smithereens. Pung! Yang Hao was close to the collision, and he was instantly sent flying after being scraped the devastating shock waves. Pa, pa, pa! Several of his bones snapped. Fortunately, he had only been hit by a weak shock wave. Otherwise, he definitely would have died. Hua Yongning and Gao Feng were both astounded. They were all at the consummate level of the heavenly body tier, so why was their power so much weaker? They had teamed up against Empress Luanxing, yet they had still almost lost. They were certain that she hadn't reached the pinnacle level of the heavenly body tier yet. So, how was she so powerful? One had to realize that this was only a spiritual mark that she had left. That being the case, just how powerful was her real self? Huh, young lady, you're a member of the 9-snake tribe. Xiao, a figure descended from the sky. He was shrouded in divine light, and it was impossible to see his height or features. However, the aura that radiated from him was absolutely terrifying. He was none other than Venerable Trinity. This eternal river tier elite had actually appeared before them. He had only been interfering casually before, yet had been already able to suppress Empress Luanxing. Although she had escaped his fetters in the end, it wouldn't be hard for him to suppress her again. However, there was only a single reason why he had revealed himself. Empress Luanxing's identity as a member of the 9-snake tribe was far too astonishing. Who would have thought? I was actually able to meet a member of the ancient divine tribes. Venerable Trinity said in excitement. He stared at Empress Luanxing as if there were flowers blossoming from her face. Empress Luanxing shuddered in apprehension. Although she had unleashed the power of the 9 snakes to break free from Venerable Trinity's grasp, she knew that he had only been suppressing her casually from someplace very far away. He hadn't been using his full power. There was an insurmountable gulf between the heavenly body tier and eternal river tier, and this was a gulf that even her 9 snakes bloodline couldn't overcome. Moreover, she hadn't reached the pinnacle level of heavenly body tier yet, and this was more so only a clone of hers. She was no match for Venerable Trinity. So what? She asked calmly. Meanwhile, she continued to shuffle closer to Ling Han. If Venerable Trinity targeted her again, she would be able to enter the Black Tower with Ling Han. Ancient divine tribe. Ha ha ha. Venerable Trinity laughed loudly, and it was clear that he was beside himself with delight. In fact, even the divine light that shrouded his body gradually dimmed and vanished, revealing a skinny and bony elder. He, the most powerful elite of the galaxy, was lost in emotion. This revealed just how excited he was at this moment. However, the more excited Venerable Trinity was, the more anxious Ling Han and Empress Luanxing became. This signified that Venerable Trinity cared very, very much about this. And Master? Yang Hao stuttered as he regained consciousness and struggled to his feet. Although several of his bones had been broken, he could still hold them together with his origin power. Walking properly wasn't much of an issue. In fact, he could still battle, though his battle prowess would definitely be affected. Venerable Trinity ignored him, and he continued to stare at Empress Luanxing, saying, Young lady, your bloodline is mine. Sure enough, this old geezer was interested in Empress Luanxing's bloodline. Although they were unsure of how he was going to obtain it, they knew that this was definitely bad news for Empress Luanxing. Let's leave. Ling Han lunged over and was just about to place Empress Luanxing into his black tower. Young man, stay out of this. Venerable Trinity didn't need to move, and he was able to restrict Ling Han with just a thought. He raised a hand and grabbed at Empress Luanxing. Yang Hao's anger surged, and since Empress Luanxing was being dealt with by Venerable Trinity, he decided to take his fury out on Ling Han. Go die! He threw a fist at Ling Han's head as he lunged toward him. Ling Han! A voice suddenly traveled over, though it sounded like it had come from the ends of the sky. Ling Han! This time, the voice sounded like it was right next to them. Pum! A figure crashed down from the sky. No one saw how she had appeared. However, she coincidentally landed on top of Yang Hao, who was trampled into the ground, forming a human-shaped crater. Ling Han, Nyo's returned! The person shouted in joy. Chapter 1212, Hunyo is angry. Chapter 1212, Hunyo is angry. She was a young girl, and she looked to be around 15 or 16 years old. Her eyes were bright, and her teeth were white. Her beauty was indescribably refreshing. Anyone who saw her would be moved by her demeanor. She would be imprinted in their minds and their bones. However, such a girl had uncannily descended from the sky. In fact, no one had seen how she had appeared. Yet, she had ruthlessly trampled Yang Hao into the ground. They couldn't help but pity Yang Hao. Was he a magnet for suffering? This girl is remarkably powerful. Meanwhile, Ling Han hesitated for a moment before subconsciously asking, "Who Niao?" Apart from her, who else referred to themselves as Niao? Ling Han. The young girl instantly dashed over. Peng! She dove into his arms, and she wrapped her legs around his waist. She was especially tall and slender to begin with, so her method of hugging made her a head taller than Ling Han. Ling Han's head was tightly pressed into her chest. Although she was only 15 or 16, her chest was already starting to develop. In fact, there was still a lot of room for growth. One could imagine just how shapely and full it would become in the future. "Niao's missed you so much," the young girl exclaimed. "Hu Niao, it's really you, Hu Niao." Ling Han was over the moon with delight. The rock palace was still the same as before, just as they had suddenly appeared before. They suddenly appeared now. "Ha! Ling Han, you're wounded." Hu Niao realized that something was off. A murderous aura burst from her body, and she immediately scanned the surroundings. She looked at Venerable Trinity and shouted, "Old geezer, was it you that wounded Niao's Ling Han?" "Ha!" Venerable Trinity replied with an indifferent chuckle. Who was he? He was the most powerful elite in this galaxy. So, why would he argue with a young girl? Though, this young girl did seem a little uncanny. However, even though he ignored them, there was no way that people who insulted an Eternal River tier elite could get off so easily. The others would deal with them for him. Gao Feng immediately stepped forward and chided, "How impudent! How dare you disrespect our venerable master?" However, he didn't dare underestimate Hu Niao even though he scolded her. Although she looked very young, she had displayed her strength by trampling Yang Hao into the ground. Who was Yang Hao? He was a prodigy among prodigies, and he was more so at the high extreme of the Sun-Moon tier. Even though he had already been injured, one would still need to be at the consummate level of the Sun-Moon tier to crush him into the earth. In fact, they might need to be at the Heavenly Body tier. If this young girl were at the Heavenly Body tier, which Gao Feng didn't believe to be the Kasi, would need to be very careful. Humph! If Niao's Ling Han was wounded by that old geezer, I'll rip him to shreds. Hu Niao said angrily, even if it wasn't him, he's still clearly the most powerful person here. Yet, he allowed the culprit to wound Niao's Ling Han. So, Niao is still going to smash him into pieces. His actions are far too detestable. Hu Niao, let go. You're about to squish me to death. Ling Han shouted. His face was buried in Hu Niao's chest, and he was suffocating to death. Hu Niao giggled as she climbed off his body like a monkey. She then glowered at the others and said, "These are all bad people. Niao is going to exterminate them in the name of the moon." Ha ha ha. Many of them burst out laughing. What a naive little girl. This was the Majestic Heaven sect, a sect that was guarded by the #1 elite in the world. Even true dragons would have to lie low if they came. In the minds of the disciples, Venerable Trinity was the strongest being in the world. This wasn't their fault, as such kind of beliefs was determined by the overall level of cultivation of a galaxy. Who could envisage a Genesis tier saint appearing here? "Father, let me deal with her," Gao Huang said as he leaped over. There was a strong sense of lust in his eyes as he stared at Hu Niao. This girl was innocent and charming, and her beauty was enough to entrance one's soul. He was going to take this opportunity to make her his concubine. Hua Yongwen humphed upon hearing this. He had been enraptured by Hu Niao's beauty, and this had caused his reaction to become slower. As such, the opportunity was stolen by Gao Huang. Gao Feng pondered over this. His son was at the consummate level of the sun-moon tier, and he was more so a 4-star genius. He was far more powerful than Yang Hao. As such, he wouldn't necessarily lose to this young girl. Could such a young girl possibly be at the heavenly body tier? Impossible. Fine, he said with a nod. Don't be careless. The young girl had knocked Yang Hao out with a single stamp, so she was definitely among the top echelon of sun-moon tier elites. Understood. Gao Huang replied. He stepped forward and said, Little girl, I'll give you a chance seeing as you're so young and naive. Hurry up, kowtow and apologize to Master. Master is benevolent, so perhaps he'll spare your life. He had to receive permission from Venerable Trinity if he wanted to take this enchanting young girl as his concubine. Otherwise, he would be seeking death. Hunyao turned to Ling Han and said, This person is a bad person. Ling Han, can I pummel him? Ling Han smiled and said, Of course. He placed a finger on Hunyao's forehead and used his divine sense to transfer the events from before. This piece of memory was very short, so it naturally wouldn't have any detrimental effects on Hunyao. Hunyao shut her eyes and then reopened them. A violent aura instantly burst from her body. Even the surrounding air was affected by her aura, and it transformed into countless blades that pointed at Gao Huang. *T. Gao Feng's expression changed drastically. This power was far too terrifying, and even he was gripped by a feeling apprehension. He frantically attacked the blades, hoping to save his son. You actually dared to insult Niu's Ling Han. Die! Hunyao extended her hand forward. Xiao, xiao, xiao! The blades instantly ripped through Gao Huang's body, turning him into a human beehive. Ah! Gao Huang wailed in agony. However, he wasn't killed by his grievous wounds. Hunyao had definitely left him alive on purpose. She had been vicious from a young age, and this hadn't changed with time. Gao Feng was both enraged and shocked. He had already stepped in, yet he still hadn't been able to save his son. Just how powerful was this young girl? And you? There was a menacing look in Hunyao's eyes as she pointed at Hua Yongwen. Boom! An air of primal chaos descended, forming into a boundless universe. Pooh! Hua Yongwen instantly vomited blood. Even though he was at the consummate level of the sun-moon tier, he was unable to withstand even a single glance from Hunyao. This wasn't the most terrifying thing. The most terrifying thing was the pieces of flesh that came out with the blood that he vomited. These were pieces of his obliterated organs. She had merely glanced and pointed at him. There hadn't been any origin power fluctuations, and there hadn't been any intertwining regulations. Yet the organs of Hua Yangwen, a prodigy, at the peak stage of the sun-moon tier had been obliterated, just like that. How terrifying was this? Damn it! Gao Huang and Hua Yongning both charged forward to attack Hunyao. Although they were unwilling to believe it, Hunyao's abilities proved that she was a heavenly body tier elite. Otherwise, how could she have severely wounded a sun-moon tier elite with a single glance? You two also dare to bully Niu's Ling Han? Humph! Hunyao made a pressing motion, and the heads of Gao Huang and Hua Yongning instantly exploded with 2 loud cracks. Even their divine senses were obliterated. Pum! Dust billowed into the air as the 2 headless corpses thudded into the ground. The surroundings became deathly silent. Everyone trembled as a sense of indescribable terror welled up in their hearts. Gao Huang and Hua Yongning weren't just some random weaklings. No, they were 2 heavenly body tier elites. Moreover, they had already reached the consummate level. Apart from the Venerable Trinity, no one else in the galaxy should have been able to kill them, let alone insta-kill both of them at once. This young girl, what was her true cultivation? Chapter 12:13 Protecting His Disciple. Chapter 12:13 Protecting His Disciple. Wasn't Ling Han a bumpkin who had come from a small world after opening the sky? However, the Empress of the Chaotic Star's majestic empire had come to help him, and she had even dared to oppose Venerable Trinity. In any case, they were at least able to accept this. She had been suppressed by Venerable Trinity, and the massive gulf between their power had been evident. It was this mysterious young girl who had descended from the sky that astounded them. She had insta-killed 2 elites who were at the consummate level of the heavenly body tier. She was definitely at the eternal river tier, right? Ling Han actually had such powerful reinforcements. Even Empress Luanxing felt slightly apprehensive. She hadn't imagined that Ling Han would have such powerful support. Although Notionless Saint was at the Genesis tier, he had already been dead for heaven knew how many years. He had more so refined his own saintly might, so he was nothing more than a nutritious treasure. He would be completely useless in battle. Anyhow, the young girl was clearly very attached to Ling Han. In fact, her attachment was already beyond all reason. It was as if she could slaughter everyone in the world as long as she could enjoy the warmth of Ling Han. With such powerful feelings, she definitely becomes jealous very easily. Perhaps she'll even kill me, Empress Luanxing thought. This wasn't impossible. Even Ling Han was astonished. He knew that the Rock Palace was very impressive, them being able to easily enter small worlds and all. This was something that even many large sects couldn't do. Thus, Hunyao would have definitely improved in leaps and bounds. However, one had to realize that his cultivation speed wasn't slow either. No, it wasn't just not slow, it was astonishingly quick. Who else in this galaxy could reach the peak stage of the pinnacle level of the mountain river tier before the age of 30? Anyhow, he was certain that the Rock Palace wouldn't let Hunyao run around by herself. That old woman in cyan was definitely protecting her in secret. That old woman was terrifyingly powerful, so she didn't need to worry about Hunyao causing a commotion. Even so, he was still stunned to discover that Hunyao had become so powerful. She could kill heavenly body tier elites at will, and her cultivation speed was so fast that he could only admit inferiority. With Hunyao as a comparison, could he still refer to himself as a prodigy? No, he was definitely an idiot, a massive idiot. Ling Han isn't an idiot, Hunyao said. It was as if she had read his mind. She hugged him and pecked him on the cheek before saying, "Niao will help Ling Han become stronger." Everyone was rendered speechless. This young girl had been like a god of death just then, yet she was suddenly like a gentle girlfriend now. They could barely believe that this was the same person. At this moment, they were extremely jealous of Ling Han. Who was this person? He had won the heart of a breathtakingly beautiful and stunningly powerful elite. Moreover, this elite was a young girl who could be educated slowly. Just thinking about this gave them a nosebleed. The pitiable Yang Hao stood up shakily. He had been knocked unconscious by Hunyau's stomp just then, so he was still unaware of the current situation. He simply felt very aggrieved. He had been knocked unconscious twice today. He was the #1 prodigy of the Majestic Heaven sect, and he had more so been taken as a disciple of an eternal river tier. However, he had been knocked out twice immediately after enjoying this huge leap in status. How could he accept this? Boom! Yang Hao's black hair shot up as he bristled in anger. Flames burst to life around him, the embodiment of his fury. He glared at Hunyao. Apart from her, there was no other newcomer present. Thus, it was evidently her who had used some unknown technique to knock him unconscious. He didn't know what technique she had used, yet he was completely unafraid. After all, this was the Majestic Heaven sect. Under the effects of his wild fury, he failed to notice the corpses of his 2 senior brothers lying on the ground. Meanwhile, Gao Huang and Hua Yangwen were still wailing in agony and vomiting mouthfuls of blood. Yang Hao didn't see or hear any of this. There was only a single thought in his mind at this moment, and that thought was revenge. Fucking *T. Do you all think I'm a pushover? How are? Venerable Trinity finally opened his mouth. There was a strong sense of warning in his voice. This young girl had insta-killed his 2 disciples, and he had actually failed to determine her cultivation. This astonished him greatly. Her cultivation level and strength definitely weren't below his. However, she was far too young, so Venerable Trinity didn't believe that she could defeat him. What frightened him was her background. Her sect or clan was capable of raising such a young Eternal River tier elite. Didn't this mean that they were a Genesis tier force? An enraged saint could annihilate an entire galaxy with a wave of their hand. Even Eternal River tier elites were like ants before them. This was especially the case with him, as he was only at the low extreme of the Eternal River tier. The gulf between him and a small saint was unfathomable. Thus, he decided to swallow this loss. Master. Yang Hao felt extremely aggrieved. Why was Venerable Trinity stopping him? Didn't he see his handsome face being trampled into the ground? Just how humiliating was that? Everyone around him shook their heads furiously. They prayed that Yang Hao wouldn't provoke Ling Han anymore. That person was a bringer of misfortune. Can't you see? 2 heavenly body tier elites have already been killed, and another 2 sun moon tier elites are clearly in their death throes. If you provoke him any more, you'll definitely be crushed to death as well. You're merely a disciple of Venerable Trinity, but what about Hanling? He's the lover of an Eternal River tier elite. Is there any comparison at all? Yang Hao was beside himself with fury. However, he didn't dare to disobey Venerable Trinity's command. He forcefully suppressed his anger and stood with his hands by his sides. However, even though he suppressed his anger, would Hunyao let him off so easily? These people actually dared to interrogate her Ling Han. They all deserved to die. She swept her gaze over Empress Luanxing, and her killing intent was evident. How irritating! I just dragged those other women away from Ling Han. Yet another one had come? Fortunately, she isn't as beautiful as Niao. I can be at ease. This was because she hadn't seen the true appearance of Empress Luanxing. Otherwise, she definitely wouldn't feel at ease. A measly being like you actually dared to feel jealous of Niao's Ling Han. Hunyao decided to start from the greatest culprit first. She glared at Yang Hao and said, "Niao's going to exterminate you." Yang Hao found this quite amusing. She was a young girl who referred to herself as Niao One. So how powerful could she be? She was clearly a naive and effeminate girl who had just stepped into the real world. However, this young girl was far too beautiful. Yang Hao felt that the sum of all the beauties he had seen in his entire life was only barely able to rival the beauty of this innocent girl. His flames of anger were quickly extinguished by her charisma. Meanwhile, Hunyao launched an attack at him. Boom! It was as if heaven were collapsing as countless meteors rained down from the sky. Raging flames seared through the sky, and the main peak of the majestic heavens sect tremored dangerously. It was an apocalyptic scene. Yang Hao instantly wet himself in fright. What fucking cultivation does she have? She unleashed a single technique. Yet it's as if heaven and earth are collapsing and the universe is imploding. Stop! Venerable Trinity finally stepped in. He hadn't reacted in time when his other 2 disciples had been killed just then. After all, even he hadn't imagined that Hunyao would be so powerful. However, Yang Hao was his newest disciple, and he had extremely high hopes for him. Yang Hao definitely couldn't die. This was a technique unleashed by an Eternal River tier elite. Wow! A silver river flowed from his body, and it was as if it could connect past with present. The silver river raised his aura to the extreme. Pa, pa, pa! Everyone in the majestic heaven sect collapsed to the ground. This aura was far too terrifying. This was the overwhelming pressure from a transcendent being. Meanwhile, the silver river formed a barrier around Yang Hao, forming almost the strongest defense in the world.